Hey everyone, welcome to FanFic Canon. Thanks for hitting play. I'm thrilled to bring this fan-made story to life for you. If you enjoy the ride and want more narrated fanfics, smash, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss an episode. And if you want audiobook of a novel of your choice, join my Patreon. Request any title that's freely available online, and I'll produce a full narration just for you. Now, let's dive into today's adventure.
Everyone froze the moment they saw Tatsuya's expression. His face was cold, sharp, and filled with a silent anger that made the air tighten. Even Kuroka, who rarely showed surprise, stiffened at the sight. Only Ophis remained unfazed. The Vala team snapped out of their shock and immediately dropped into fighting stances. Fear lingered behind their eyes, but they still prepared to face him. Tatsuya turned his gaze toward them and spoke in a low, calm voice that sent chills down their spines. "I don't think that's necessary. And if I were you, I'd lower your weapons before my hand slips. That wouldn't be pleasant, at least, not for you." They gulped in sync, but didn't back down. They were seconds away from attacking him, until a voice cut through the tension. "Don't interfere. It's my fight." Vala stepped out of the rubble, covered in dust and bruises but still standing. Tatsuya whistled. "You survived that? Tougher than I thought." Vala snorted, summoned his sacred gear, and launched himself forward at inhuman speed. He closed the distance instantly and smashed a punch straight toward Tatsuya's face. A burst of wind exploded around them as dust swallowed the scene. The Vala team, minus Kuroka, grinned, expecting the hit to land. But as the dust cleared, their smiles vanished. Tatsuya stood unmoved, casually holding Vala's fist in one hand. "Not a scratch on him." "You pack a punch," he said with a grin, "but it's still not enough." He tightened his grip, bones creaking under the pressure. Vala groaned, and before he could recover, Tatsuya's hand glowed. A moment later, Vala was trapped inside a key sphere and blasted away like a projectile. The sphere exploded midair, drawing worried looks from his teammates. Tatsuya didn't stop. He formed a massive key orb and hurled it toward Vala. Before it made contact, space in front of Vala split open. Arthur had cut a pathway through space. The attack slipped inside, then detonated far away. Both Vala and Tatsuya turned to the glowing rip in the air. "You all right, Vala?" Biko called out. Arthur stood next to him, a glowing sword radiating holy energy in hand. Vala's expression twisted as he shouted, "Don't interfere. It's my fight. But I said, don't interfere." The team looked torn, unsure if they should obey. Tatsuya raised a hand. "Relax. I'm not going to kill him. I'm just teaching him why you shouldn't provoke someone way out of your league." Relief washed over them. He then eyed the sword in Arthur's hand. "Nice blade." Arthur nodded. "A fragment of Excalibur ruler. It manipulates space." Tatsuya smirked. "Andy, I think I'll get one too. Trace on." A flash of light appeared. In the next instant, he was holding an identical sword. Shock erupted across the team. Arthur stared at his own blade, then at Tatsuya's copy, unsure if his was still real. Tatsuya swung it experimentally. "Vala, ready or not, I'm coming." He loaded the sword with magic and unleashed a sweeping arc of holy energy toward Vala. "Divide, divide, divide, divide." The air echoed as Vala absorbed wave after wave. His wings flared and his voice deepened. "Looks like I need to get serious." A glowing fusion of his and Albion's voices followed. Vanishing dragon, balance breaker, white dragon armor wrapped around him, wings spreading wide. Meanwhile, Tatsuya inspected the sword in his hand. Not as impressive as I expected. He dismissed it and looked at Vala's armor with an amused smile. "Okay, that looks cool." Vala smirked. "This is the power of a Longinus. A sacred gear capable of killing gods. Try not to die." While Vala indulged in his speech, Tatsuya murmured under his breath, "Trace on." When Vala finished, Tatsuya spoke with a grin. "Since you're so proud of that armor, I guess I should try it too." Vanishing dragon, balance breaker, a matching set of white armor wrapped around him. Shock rippled through the group. Only Ophis seemed mildly surprised before shrugging. Inside his helmet, Vala's mouth hung open. He whispered to Albion, "Is his armor real, or just a copy?" Albion hesitated. "I don't know, partner." "What do you mean you don't know?" "I can't feel anything like my presence inside his armor, but at the same time, it feels identical. I can't explain it." Vala processed that, then smirked fiercely. Only one way to find out. He shot forward, and was instantly punched in the gut. "Not so fast," Tatsuya said, tossing him away. Tatsuya teleported in front of him again and delivered another strike. He flexed his fingers. "Not bad. This armor has room to grow." Vala stabilized himself midair and shouted, "Divide!" A glow wrapped around Tatsuya as some of his energy drained. "Oh, so you want to play that way?" He formed dozens of magic orbs and fired them. Vala grinned widely. "Thank for the feast." "Divide! Divide! 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 Divide!" Each orb shrank as he devoured their power. But he suddenly froze. Tatsuya had vanished. "You should never lose sight of your opponent," came a voice from above. Vala looked up, just in time to see a massive blue sphere in Tatsuya's hand. Massive Rasengan. Vala was driven downward, unable to divide the attack. "Albion, why can't I absorb it? That energy, I don't recognize it. I can't divide what I don't understand." Tatsuya smirked. "Of course you don't. Chakra doesn't exist in this world." The attack crushed Vala into the ground, carving a massive crater before exploding. A dust cloud swallowed the area. When it cleared, Vala stood shakily at the bottom, armor shattered and body bruised, but still standing. Tatsuya dropped his own armor. "I'm impressed. You really took all that and stayed on your feet." "Respect." Vala glared. "Shut up. I'm not done. I'll fight until I drop." He reactivated his armor. Tatsuya sighed. "As you wish. But this one will hurt, demonic dragon." He inhaled slowly, deeply, until his lungs were full. A white glow formed in his mouth. "Vala," Albion warned, "I have a bad feeling about this. Retreat while you can." Vala Lucifer, never back down from a fight. Especially not this one." Albion sighed. "Then brace yourself." Tatsuya didn't wait. "Holy dragon! Roar!" A colossal blast of dragon-slaying holy magic rushed forward. Vala fired a beam back, but it shattered instantly. The roar swallowed him whole. When the light finally faded, Vala lay collapsed, armor flickering and broken. Tatsuya descended beside him and exhaled. "Maybe I went a little overboard." Tatsuya stood over the collapsed Vala, quietly watching him struggle to stay conscious. The rest of the team walked over, forming a small circle around their leader. They glanced at Vala, then at Tatsuya. "Just asking," Biko said, squinting at Vala. "Is he still alive? He doesn't look like he's got any life left in him." Tatsuya didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up a small pebble, weighed it in his fingers, and flicked it with a bit of force. The pebble flew straight down and nailed Vala in the crotch. "Ah!" Everyone flinched at the sound and looked at Vala, who was now curled up, clutching his precious area and groaning in agony. "Yup," Tatsuya said calmly, "he's still alive." There was a beat of silence. Then Kuroka and Biko broke into loud laughter. Arthur just sighed. "Was that really necessary?" Arthur asked. "Taking it that far?" Tatsuya looked at him with a flat expression. "What would you do if someone threatened to kill your sister?" Arthur didn't even hesitate. "I'd cut them into so many pieces they'd look like a jigsaw puzzle." Tatsuya smiled faintly. "See? You get me." Inwardly, he snorted. "If you can think of going that far for your sister, be grateful I didn't just kill Vala on the spot." Arthur sighed again, but this time he nodded in understanding. He walked over to Vala, crouched down, and stared at him. "Now do you understand why you don't just provoke people out of nowhere?" Vala's body was still trembling with pain, but he managed to turn his head, a satisfied smile on his face. It felt really good. Tatsuya blinked, then slowly turned toward the Vala team. "Is he a masochist?" Kuroka and Biko, who had just recovered from laughing, completely lost it again. Arthur was biting back his own laughter while covering Lu Fei's ears. "Tatsuya-sen," he said, voice strained, "you shouldn't say things like that in front of someone innocent." Biko walked over, eyeing Valley up and down. You really look messed up right now. I should take a picture. He took out his phone and snapped a shot. Arthur glared at him. Hey, didn't I just tell you not to say weird things in front of her? He said, still shielding Le Fay's ears. Then his expression turned serious. Anyway, how are you planning to go back in that condition? Biko slipped his phone away. Yeah, he is definitely going to want to know how you managed to get wrecked this badly. Hey, no obscene words. Arthur shot back automatically. Tatsuya tilted his head. Biko looked at him, then snapped his fingers. All right, you don't know. We're talking about his foster parent, Azazel. Valley and Arthur both turned and glared at him at the same time. Biko froze. What? He said. Then realization hit him. His eyes widened. Oh, right. He scratched the back of his head, embarrassed. Yeah, I probably shouldn't have just given that away. My bad. The mood grew a little tense. Tatsuya sighed. Relax. You don't need to worry. As long as he doesn't bother me too much, I won't do anything. He turned his gaze back to Valley, eyes cold. And that goes for you too. Next time, I'll mess you up on a whole different level. Hey, Arthur snapped. Valley looked up at Tatsuya, displeased. Then next time, accept my challenge properly without going that far. It just felt too good. Tatsuya stared at him, then glanced at the others. You're really sure he's not a masochist? I said stop it. Arthur shouted, veins popping on his forehead. Tatsuya walked up to Valley and sighed. I'll think about it. For now, I'll at least heal you enough to walk. He placed his hand over Valley and started healing him, closing the worst of the wounds. After a bit, he stood up and looked at Arthur and Biko. Help him up. They nodded and supported Valley by his shoulders until he got his balance. Tatsuya handed Valley an envelope. Give this to Azazel. It'll help explain things. I'm guessing you're hiding the fact that you're with a terrorist group from him. Valley just nodded and took it. A magic circle formed beneath his feet. Arthur and Biko stepped back. Valley glanced at Tatsuya, thinking he did all that just to protect his family. I guess having something to protect really does make you stronger. Tatsuya picked that up easily through telepathy and smiled faintly. You've got a family too, he said, nodding toward the team behind him. Valley was caught off guard for a moment, then smiled. Next time, you'll be the one in the crater, he said. Tatsuya snorted. You're 100 years too early to say that. Valley smirked. Till next time, then. Tatsuya raised a hand in a casual wave. Yeah. Valley vanished in a magic circle. Tatsuya turned to the others. Well, looks like it's time for us to head back too. They all nodded, but Biko couldn't help himself. Hey, what was in that envelope anyway? Tatsuya's lips curled into an evil smile. Ask him yourself. Biko really wanted to know, and that smile confirmed it was something good, but he decided to save the question for later. As Tatsuya was about to leave, Kuroka suddenly leaped at him. He stepped aside smoothly. He said, wagging his finger. Kuroka pouted and looked away. Tatsuya sighed, walked back to her, leaned in, and gave her a quick peck on the cheek. Later, he said, and teleported away. Kuroka froze, face turning bright red. She hadn't expected him to take the initiative. Biko watched her and smirked. Oh, the always flirty Kuroka blushing from a kiss on the cheek. That's new. He rubbed his chin like a commentator. Shut up, Biko, Kuroka snapped. Fuck off. Arthur immediately exploded. Shut it. How many times do I have to say it? Don't use obscene words in front of children. Grigori headquarters. Vala stepped back into Grigori, beaten half to death. Azazel took one look at him and froze. Why the hell do you look like trash? Vala said nothing. He simply handed over the envelope. Azazel raised a brow, but opened it. Inside was a letter and a discount coupon for Tatsuya's restaurant. He glanced at the coupon, then unfolded the letter and started reading. By the time he finished, his expression had turned oddly serious. Vala tensed. What the hell did he write in there? Azazel cleared his throat. So, you've grown up, huh? Feels like just yesterday I picked up the brat you were, and now look at you. Time really flies. He stared off for a second, lost in thought, then snapped back and nodded to himself. Anyway, it seems it's finally time to pass my legacy on to you. He summoned a book with magic and handed it to Valley. Vala stared at it, suspicious, then read the title. The Art of True Perversion by Azazel. He looked up, utterly confused, but Azazel spoke first. That book has every method known to perverts, from beginners to masters. It's a fully polished manual, approved by millions worldwide. It'll help you a lot. As my son, there's no way I can accept you getting caught peeping like some amateur. Azazel was completely serious. Vala managed. Azazel stood up, clenching a fist. From now on, I'll personally lecture you on perversion. You should feel honored. Not everyone gets this training for free. Wait a second. What are you even talking about? Vala said, panicking. Azazel smiled warmly. No need to be shy. You're a healthy young man. This is proof I raised you well. I don't understand anything you're saying, Vala replied flatly. Azazel raised a brow. Weren't you caught peeping on women in a hot spring? And then beaten to hell by your friend because his family was in there too? Honestly, I'm surprised he managed to pound you that badly. He's a good friend, though. Even gave me a discount coupon to that famous restaurant in Kuo. He held up the coupon with a proud look. I'm glad you have such great friends. Vala's eye twitched. He snatched the letter and read it himself. By the end, he was shaking with rage. That bastard. I'll destroy him next time I see him. Albion was howling with laughter in his mind. You got played. Ha ha ha. How's he even come up with this stuff? This is amazing. Shut up, Albion. Valley roared internally. Azazel rested a hand on his shoulder. Make sure you master the art of perversion. It's our legacy, after all. Vala finally snapped. Tatsuya, I'm going to kill you. After all the things were over, Tatsuya teleported back to his house. He opened the door and entered the house. He checked the house with his presence detection and found everyone. All the girls were sleeping in his room. Tatsuya sighed and decided to take a bath. After taking a bath, he went to the kitchen, he made himself some overnight snack, and after eating it, he went and slept on the couch. The next morning, he woke up. He found Kurumi sleeping with him. He shrugged it off and held her tightly and went back to sleep. Kurumi, who was awakened by his action, blushed and held him more tightly and snuggled up to him and slept as well. After sleeping a few more hours, Tatsuya suddenly woke up because he felt some killing intent. He got ready and looked at source of the killing intent and found Miyuki glaring at him. Tatsuya sighed and asked, what happened? Miyuki didn't said anything and kept glaring at him. Tatsuya, who was a bit confused, looked around him and found Kurumi sleeping with him. Now understanding what happened, he sighed and said, it's not my fault, she was the one who came on the couch I was sleeping on. Miyuki was dissatisfied by his answer and said, but you could have just kicked her off the couch. Tatsuya looked weirdly at Miyuki and asked, and why would I do that? Hearing his question, Miyuki fell silent, not knowing how to answer. Seeing that she was not answering, Tatsuya said, you can't answer me, can you? Tatsuya sighed and said, just think about it. How would you feel if I were to shove you away every time you try to act clingy to me? Miyuki tried imagining what Tatsuya just said and then broke out crying. Seeing her cry, Tatsuya looked at her and said, feels bad, right? I too would feel the same if any of you were to do that to me, and hugged Miyuki and started consoling her. While he kept consoling Miyuki, both Kurumi and Himari had woken up and were sitting near them. Himari wanted to ask what was happening, but seeing Miyuki crying, she stopped and waited for her to calm down. Once Miyuki stopped crying, Tatsuya looked at her and said, I know that you do like me, and being possessive for the one you like is understandable, and I don't mind you being possessive, just tone it down a little, because it do hurts me seeing you get hurt, but you understand that just like you, those too like me as well. Just think, how do they feel seeing the person they like with other girls? Tatsuya then lowered his head and said, I do know that I'm a scumbag and apologize to you all, but I cannot choose any one of you over the other, and if you dislike me for being indecisive, then you dash. Just as he was about to continue, all the three girls put their hands on his mouth and said, now, why are you being so overdramatic? It doesn't suit you at all. Tatsuya sighed and said, yeah, you were right. Those cliche lines were making me want to puke. Anyways, you understand what I meant to say, right? It's up to you guys to decide. Kurumi grinned and said, what are you taking about? You are my Jinchuriki, and also I cannot survive in this world without being connected to you. So we're stuck together for our whole life. Himari then placed her hand on his shoulder and said, I too am not leaving, as you did promise me to take responsibility for me. Though you meant as a pet, but still you're going to take care of me, and I've already raised my status from your cat to your lover, right? She smiled and looked at Tatsuya and said, and besides, if I leave you alone, who is going to cook food for you when you are tired? I cannot depend on these fools who only know two things in kitchen: boiling the water and freezing ice cubes. Both Miyuki and Kurumi glared at Himari, who looked back at them with a smug look on her face. Seeing her smug, both of them wanted to rebuke, but they knew that what Himari was saying was true. Miyuki then looked at Tatsuya and said, and I cannot leave you as well, because if I leave you alone, who is going to protect you from all the horny bitches who are eyeing you on the street? And I will also try to tone my possessiveness down a bit, but only a bit. When she said that, both Himari and Kurumi looked at her weirdly and said, who are you, imposter? Where is the cold-hearted Yandere girl we know? You are not Miyuki. Where is she? Hearing them, Miyuki's lips twitched, and she said, if not for Oni Isama hugging me right now, you too would have been done for. Seeing their interaction, Tatsuya laughed and said, looks like you all are stuck with me, huh? Well, I'll try my best so that you're not going to get rid of me soon, and smiled at them. Seeing his smile, they were mesmerized and thought at the same time, I have a feeling that there will be many more joining us later. Well, whatever, it cannot be helped after all, he is the best. Tatsuya, who saw them motionless, sighed and enclosed them in a bear hug and said, I love you all. Hearing him, they all snuggled closer to him and said, we already know. After talking with each other for a bit longer, they all decided to have breakfast, and Tatsuya decided to check on Ingvild and Keisha. Tatsuya knocked on the door and waited for a response. After a while, Tatsuya heard it come in and enter the room. Tatsuya looked at both his guests and asked Keisha, how are you feeling? Hearing his question, Keisha started to check her body, and after confirming everything, she looked at Tatsuya and said, it's better than before. She then gave a sigh and said, I still cannot believe how can I heal so fast. Tatsuya, who saw her reaction, chuckled. Seeing him chuckle, Keisha looked at him and asked, what's so funny here? Tatsuya stopped chuckling and said, nothing. Anyways, it's good that you're feeling well and you're healing faster because I enhanced your recovery using my magic. He then looked at Ingvild and asked, is there any change in her since then? Keisha too looked at Ingvild and said with a sad tone, unfortunately, no. There is still no change in her condition. Suddenly, Tatsuya placed his hand on her shoulder and said, don't worry. You did what you could. Now it's my job to heal her. Hearing him, Keisha smiled and said, well, then make sure that you don't waste my hard work and heal her soon. Tatsuya looked at her and said, getting ahead of yourself, and flicked her forehead. Keisha's face twitched in pain, and then she glared at Tatsuya and said, what the hell was that for? Tatsuya didn't said anything and smiled, and then again flicked her forehead. Keisha looked at Tatsuya with rage and said, hey, I dash. Before she could say anything, Tatsuya flicked her forehead again. This kept on happening for a while, and finally, unable to bear, Keisha looked at Tatsuya with tears in her eyes and said, stop, I apologize for getting ahead of myself. Tatsuya again moved his hands towards her, and seeing that, Keisha shut her eyes close. But instead of feeling pain, she felt comfortable and looked up. Tatsuya, who was easing her pain with his magic, looked at her and said, sorry about that. Keisha wanted to snap at him, but refrained from doing that. She glared at Tatsuya and thought, once I am healed and these restraints are removed, I will pay you back for all the mean things that you did to me, and started laughing inside her mind. Tatsuya heard her thoughts through telepathy and sighed. He healed her forehead and then removed his hand. Keisha looked at him with a slight disappointment, but didn't say anything. Tatsuya looked at her and said, well, I will be going for now and will return to treat her later. Make sure to rest well and wait for me, and ruffled her hair. Keisha snorted and said, stop ruining my hair and just go. She then looked away and smiled. Tatsuya left the room and went to have breakfast with others. He asked Himari to even prepare something for the guests and then left for work. After working for several hours in his restaurant, Tatsuya left and decided to go back home. After entering the house, Tatsuya took a bath and got refreshed. He then went towards the room Keisha and Ingvild was in. He knocked on the door and, after waiting for a while, entered. He looked at Keisha, raised his hand, and said, "Yo," and went towards her. He then took something out of his storage and placed it in front of Keisha. Keisha looked at the thing in front of her and saw a paper cup filled with some sort of drink in it. She then looked at Tatsuya with a confused look and asked, "What is this?" Tatsuya looked at her blankly and said, "Milkshake," and then went toward Ingvild and started transferring his magic while drinking one himself. Keisha too didn't thought much and decided to sip on hers silently. They kept on talking to each other while Tatsuya was in the room so as to kill some time. After hours of waiting, Ingvild's finger twitched a little. Seeing the change in her condition, Tatsuya stopped talking and started to pump more energy into her to the point she started glowing. Seeing the change, Keisha too looked at both of them intently. Her hopes of treating Sarorg's mother were increasing as she was seeing Tatsuya cure Ingvild. And after a long wait, Ingvild finally opened her eyes. After getting her senses back to normal, she started looking around and saw a handsome boy standing near her and a beautiful girl lying on one bed. She looked at both of them and asked in a confused voice, "Where am I?" Keisha was about to answer, but Tatsuya suddenly stopped her and said, "You are in a place where mortals like you appear before going for an afterlife." Ingvild and Keisha, who heard him, had different reactions. Keisha was wondering what Tatsuya was doing, but didn't interrupt him and let him do as he pleased. Ingvild, who heard Tatsuya, was even more confused and asked, "What afterlife? Am I dead or what?" Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Yes, my child, you are dead indeed, and is about to go to the next plane from here on, depending on your deeds. And by checking your records, I can even let you live in a different world with a wish no less, or you could go to heaven and live your life peacefully there." Ingvild then looked at him intently and asked, "Are you some kind of god?" "That's true, my child. I am the god who is in charge of soul management and decides where souls of the dead go." He then dramatically opened his arms, and his body started glowing. He looked at Ingvild and asked, "So ask my child, what do you desire? You have one wish, so think carefully." Ingvild, who heard him, remained silent and was digesting the information she got. After she was done, she looked back at Tatsuya and asked, "Can I go back in my own world?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, that's not possible, as in your world you are already dead." Hearing him, Ingvild got depressed and looked down. Seeing her, Tatsuya too got a bit sad and said, "I cannot send you to your world in your time, but I can still send you a few years after you died." Ingvild raised her head and looked at Tatsuya with some hope. She asked, "How many years further?" Tatsuya looked back at her and said, 100 years. Ingvild's face became neutral, and she looked intently at Tatsuya and asked, "How can you say 100 years as a few?" Tatsuya, who heard her, looked back at her with a neutral expression as well and said, "It's the best offer I can give. Take it or leave it." Ingvild then again started thinking and after a while sighed and said, "Okay, I want to go back to my own world." Tatsuya then asked her with an intrigued voice, "It shall be done, but may I ask, why do you want to go back to your own world when there is nothing that you will recognize, as the civilization has advanced a lot since then? You even had the option to go to another world and start from the beginning." Ingvild then showed a helpless smile and said, "I want to go back to my old world because I have not yet seen anything there. The only thing that I have seen is my own town, the sea, and I only had some friends. That's why I want to go back to my old world and explore it and make more friends." Tatsuya still looked confused and asked, "But can't you do the same in the new world? You can explore it and even make new friends there, so why do you want to go back?" Ingvild then said, "I want to explore my world first and want to experience it whole. Even if the idea of a new world is intriguing, I somehow still feel attached to my own world." Tatsuya looked at her and thought, "Cliché." But then Ingvild made a serious expression and said, "Plus there's also a possibility that the new world is not safe. What if it is a world that treats women unfairly? There's also a possibility of being sent to dangerous location. I can even be sent their creature. There are lots and lots of unsuitable possibilities in that new world, and I even know nothing about it." Listening to her, Tatsuya too got impressed by her intellect and asked, "Then how can you believe there are no such things in your previous world? After all, the society surely would have undergone a change in 100 years? Ingvild heard his question and answered with a smile, "I don't know that. I am just taking a gamble here. And there's also a fact that I at least know something about my own world, like language and sorts. I know that I'm taking a big gamble, but that's all what I can think of. Tatsuya then rubbed his chin and asked, then what about going to the heaven? You also have that option. Ingvald shook her head and said, that's a big no because what I said in the beginning is also true. I still want to explore the world and make new friends. Tatsuya looked at her with a neutral expression and asked, are you sure? There are many who would want what you are simply refusing. Ingvald smiled and said, I will think of going there the next time I will die. After all, even if I die again, I will come back here, right? Tatsuya smiled and said, that's true. Then what is the wish that you want? Ingvald smiled brightly and said, the wish I want is high immunity to diseases of all kinds. Tatsuya then looked at her with a confused expression and asked, why do you want that? You can easily ask for power, money, looks, etc., and all you want is immunity. What? Ingvald then again smiled helplessly and said, you see, I was not able to explore the world and make a lot of friends because my body was always prone to diseases and most of the time I was on my bed, so this time I want to avoid all that. Tatsuya gave an understanding nod and then raised his hand and pointed it at Ingvald. Ingvald looked at his hand and then suddenly her body started glowing. She started checking her body and thought, this feels so good and even the pain in my body is easing. What a bliss. Her body then stopped glowing and she looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked back at her as well and said, I have fulfilled your wish and you are now back in your world. Now step out of the room and walk straight in the hallway. Once you reach a room with a big table at the center, you will find 3 girls there. Ask them to help you check your body's physical condition. Tell then that Tatsuya said so. He then motioned at the door and said, now go. Ingvald only nodded and then stepped out of the room. Once the door was close and Tatsuya made sure that Ingvald was gone, Tatsuya sighed and said, talking like that felt way too weird. I'm not doing that again. Keisha, who was silent during the whole ordeals, finally opened her mouth and asked, what the hell was that? Tatsuya looked at her and said with a neutral tone, consequences of making me sit here without doing anything. Keisha looked at him with a deadpan expression and asked, was that fine for us to do that? Tatsuya waved his hand and said, relax, it's not a big deal. Besides, she did wake up after 100 years. I was more worried about what to do if she asked to transport her to another world. Keisha thought for a bit and then shrugged her shoulders and said, whatever, it was not me who said anything. You would be the only one who will bear the consequences anyway. Hearing her, Tatsuya's lips twitched a bit. She then looked at him and asked, and what was that glow on her? Tatsuya then again looked at her and said, oh, that, I just eased the soreness in her body joints and healed the after effects of the treatment, that's all. Just as he finished saying that, the door of the room was suddenly opened and then a purple blur was seen. The next moment, Ingvald was holding Tatsuya's collar and was shaking him while saying, you lied to me. After Ingvald calmed down a bit and stopped shaking Tatsuya, she started to get embarrassed and covered her face with her hands. Tatsuya adjusted his clothes, then looked towards Ingvald, and then said, sorry, with a slight bow, and then stood there in silence. Feeling awkward by the silence, Ingvald looked at Tatsuya from between her fingers, and when she saw him not in the slightest bit flustered and his neutral expression, she became even more nervous. Seeing that how nervous she was feeling, Tatsuya sighed and said, sit down first, let us explain what happened for you to be present here, or more clearly, what we actually know about. Ingvald sheepishly nodded her head and sat down on the bed she was lying on, and Tatsuya sat beside Keisha. Tatsuya then looked at Ingvald and said, my name is Tatsuya, a human, and this lazy person who remained lying all the time is Keisha, a devil. We are your actual parents. Both the girls became motionless after hearing what he said. Ingvald started muttering, my actual mom and dad. My parents look as old as me. Does that mean that I will never grow up just like them? Soon Keisha came out of shock and shouted, who are you calling lazy, you bastard? I am still recovering, and besides, how the hell she became my daughter? Suddenly the door of the room was opened with a loud this, and the room suddenly became cold. Tatsuya looked in the direction and saw Miyuki, whose eyes were covered with hair. There were also Himari and Kurumi behind her, sighing. Miyuki looked up and said in a cold voice, Which of you bitch is a daughter with Oni-sama? Tell me now. Seeing her, both Keisha and Ingvild got scared, and Ingvild immediately pointed at Keisha. Keisha too wanted to point at Ingvild, but could not as her hands were broken. Keisha gulped her saliva, and then looked at Miyuki with fear and said, "Wait, Miyuki, this is a misunderstanding. I have no relationship with Tatsuya. He is just pulling a prank." But all her pleas were in vain, and Miyuki started walking towards her and said, "You harlot, you dare taint Oni-sama with your worthlessness. My Oni-sama, you need to die." Miyuki then formed an ice spike and continued walking. She again looked at the scared Keisha and said, "Don't worry though, I will give you a painless death, and I promise to not kill your child because she also belonged to Oni-sama." Miyuki was about to stab Keisha, but Tatsuya stopped her hand and then gave her a light head chop. Miyuki then looked at Tatsuya with her normal expression and asked, "What happened, Oni-sama? Why do you hit me?" Seeing her sudden change, both Keisha and Ingvild were speechless. Both Himari and Kurumi were trying their very best not to laugh on seeing their reactions. Tatsuya then held Miyuki's face and moved it so that she faced Ingvild and asked, "What age do you think she is?" Miyuki looked at Ingvild intently and then turned towards Tatsuya with a smile and said, "She is probably around my age." Tatsuya nodded and smiled and said, "Then how the hell do you think that I can make a child when I was just a year old?" Hearing his question, Miyuki blanked for a while and then asked, "Then about the child?" Tatsuya sighed and said, "It was just a prank." "Geez, you jump to conclusions too quickly. You should analyze the situation first before taking any actions, understand?" And started petting her head. Receiving the head pat, Miyuki was in bliss. After petting her for a while, Tatsuya stopped, making her feel a bit disappointed, but she became normal and turned towards Keisha and said, "I am sorry for threatening you just now. I hope that you don't take it too seriously." Hearing her apology, Keisha rapidly started shaking her head and said, "No, you don't have to apologize. It was just a misunderstanding. The one who is actually at fault here is Tatsuya. If he didn't try to make such a prank, there would be no such problem." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Are you really sure that you should speak badly of me? If not for me, not even Himari and Kurumi could have saved you. Maybe next time I should not stop her." Just as he finished speaking, he saw Keisha bowing her head as much as she could. Keisha, who suddenly thought about what would have happened if Tatsuya would have not stopped Miyuki again, became frightened and bowed her head and said, "I'm very grateful for receive your kindness, Tatsuya-sama. I will always remember it and will help you whenever you would be in need of me." Tatsuya nodded his head in satisfaction and said, "Good. There's no problem as long as you understand. You may raise your head now." Keisha then raised her head and gave a sigh of relief. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, and she turned her head and saw Himari. Himari looked at her and said, "You will be used to all this in time." Keisha wasn't sure what to say and simply nodded her head. After everyone was calmed down, Tatsuya turned towards Ingvild and said, "Sorry for all that." Ingvild didn't said anything and continued to stare at him. She then sighed and said, "I am Ingvild Leviathan, a human/devil hybrid. I hope that you will not pull any more pranks." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Of course, I hope that we get along from now on." Ingvild nodded her head and said, "I hope so as well. Now are you going to tell me why am I here?" Tatsuya nodded her head and then looked at Keisha and said, "Your turn now." Keisha nodded her head and then started explaining Ingvild about the situation. After Keisha stopped talking, Ingvild started thinking. Tatsuya, who saw this, looked at her and said, "Take your time. We are not in a hurry." Ingvild nodded her head and continued. After a while, she looked back at others and said, "Looks like I really slept for 100 years. She then turned towards Tatsuya and bowed her head a bit and said, "Thank you for curing me. I am very grateful to you. If there is anything that you want my help with, then don't hesitate to ask." Tatsuya waved his hand and said, "No problem there, and even if I would not have helped, you would have woken up in a few years or so. I just lessened the time in which you would have woken up." Ingvild then looked at him and said, "Even so, I am very grateful for that," and smiled. Tatsuya only nodded his head and then stood silent. Keisha then looked at Tatsuya and asked, Tatsuya, you just said that you only decreased the time she needed to recover. What do you mean by that? Hearing her question, Tatsuya turned serious and said, What I mean is that I was not the one who was curing her. She was already being cured by her sacred gear, who was absorbing her energy to take its form. I only supplied it with more energy to fasten its pace. Tatsuya then turned towards Ingvild and asked, Now what will you do? Where will you stay from now on? Ingvild thought for a while and then said, I don't know, but I will work something out. You don't have to be worried about me. Tatsuya looked at her sternly and said, Who said I was worrying about you? Looks like you don't understand my question. He then sighed and looked back at her and said, Let me reframe it. What I mean to ask is, how are you going to survive in the world right now? Hearing his question, all of them became confused, and seeing all of them, Tatsuya gave an annoyed sigh and said, You guys seriously don't understand a thing? I am saying that you are not just any devil. You are a descendant of the former Devil King Leviathan. Once the factions come to know of your existence, your life will become a literal hell. The new devils will probably try to either kill you or would torture to interrogate you, and the old devil faction will surely try to recruit you and use you in the power struggle. Not to mention the angels and fallen angels will also come after your head. And don't tell me that you can lay low in this world forever. So I ask you again, what will you do now? Hearing all the things that could happen to her, Ingvild became uncertain of her earlier decision and started thinking what to do. Keisha wanted to ask her to join Sarorg's peerage, but the fact that Tatsuya told about what the devils would do to her once they come to know of her existence made her stop. She then began thinking about a solution for her problem, but couldn't think of anything. Same thing was going on with the other girls present in the room. Tatsuya finally stepped forward and said, If you don't have anywhere to go, then why don't you join my team? All of them then looked at Tatsuya speechlessly. Noticing all the gazes at him, Tatsuya looked back at them and asked, What? Keisha was the first to speak, and she said, I didn't know that you were a good person. Tatsuya's brows twitched a bit, and he said, Aren't you freeloading on this good person's home? Hearing him, Keisha became red from embarrassment and looked away. Ingvild then looked at Tatsuya and asked, Why do you want me to be in your team? Tatsuya then looked back at Ingvild and shrugged his shoulders and said, I'm not being good to you. You can call it something like an investment. Having a descendant of a devil king with a sacred gear, no less. Is there anything that I can argue to not ask you to join my team? Tatsuya then raised his hand and said, In return you will get, and started counting on his fingers, 1, a shelter, 2, nutrition, 3, training for fighting and self-defense, 4, and of course the protection from all other factions. I don't want to brag, but I can assure you that the only people who know that we belong to the supernatural world are only the people whom we told about it ourselves. So what is your answer? And also you will also help in house chores, and sometimes work in a restaurant if there is too much rush. Ingvild then began thinking, and after thinking for a while, she looked at Tatsuya and said, I would like to join, but I don't want to trouble you and put you all in danger. Hearing her, Tatsuya sighed and said, Look, if you're not joining only because you don't want to put us in danger, then that's no worry for us. All of us are pretty strong, and I can annihilate any enemy we face. Ingvild then asked, If you can annihilate anyone, then why are you making a team? Tatsuya looked at her and said, Well, I am forming a team because even though I can annihilate anyone, there are still times when I may not be able to reach on time. And at those times, having a group would be better for my team, as most of the time Kurumi would be with me, making these two left alone to face the enemy. So I'm forming a group only to reassure myself that nothing happens to the others in my team. Ingvild then squinted her eyes a bit and asked, Then do you mean that if I was not capable enough, you would not have asked me to join your team? Tatsuya nodded her head and said, Yes, I would not have asked you to join my team then. Protecting such a comrade is no problem for me. But not being able to protect such a comrade when I am not nearby will make me more depressed. And it would not be only me. Others in the team would also feel sad if such a thing were to happen. Tatsuya then looked away and said, I don't want that. Don't want to see a comrade die when I am still alive. He didn't turn back and said, I will ask you one last time. Will you join my team? Ingvild looked at him for a while and then hugged him and said, Okay, I will join. I don't want to see my savior sad. And besides, you did promise me that you will protect me as well, right? And smiled. Tatsuya also smiled and said, "Of course, welcome to the team, Ingvild. I hope that we get along well." After joining the team, Ingvild has also started living in the Shiba residence. Most of her time is usually spent on learning about the changes that the society has undergone in the past century. Tatsuya has also started training her, which sometimes made her question herself whether her decision of joining his team was correct or not, but she stopped complaining once she Tatsuya's cooking and now trains diligently. Tatsuya also checks the condition of her body from time to time, so as to confirm if her body is properly healed or not. She has also learned the most important rule of the Shiba household: no one touched the coffee jelly. Ingvild has also come to admire Tatsuya because of him being an all-rounder. Seeing his battle against both Himari and Miyuki made her speechless. Like this, a week passed, and now Keisha has been fully healed. Tatsuya went to her room and entered without knocking. As he entered the room, he saw a naked Keisha changing her clothes. They made eye contact with each other and stared for a while. Tatsuya then turned around and said, "Sorry, force of habit," and left the room. Keisha was left blushing inside the room, and she quickly changed her clothes and then quickly went out of the room. As soon as she opened the door and stepped forward, she crashed into Tatsuya, making her fall backwards, but before she fell, Tatsuya caught her and then made her stand still. She glared at him and said, "Don't you have the decency of knocking before entering the room?" Tatsuya rubbed the back of his head and said sheepishly, "Sorry about that. But hey, look on the bright side. It showed me how much your health has improved over the past week. Before you came here, you were not even able to move your hands and legs, and now you're able to change your clothes and is also able to run after me. So when you take all that into consideration, what all happened was only a small price to pay." Hearing him, Keisha got a bit angry and said, "You just saw a woman's naked body. Do you think that is a petty thing?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "I didn't say that it was a petty thing. In fact, I felt that the view was great. I can already say that you would turn out to be a beautiful woman once you grow up." When she heard what Tatsuya said, she blushed and said, "That's not the problem here." Tatsuya then sighed and said, "Then if it makes you feel any better, then you can see me naked as well," and started to take out his shirt, but before he could take it off, Keisha caught his hands and said while blushing, "Stop, stop, stop, there is no need for that. I forgive you," and sighed. She then took a glance at his body and blushed more. Tatsuya then adjusted his clothes and then looked at Keisha, who was looking down in shame. Sighing, Tatsuya put a hand on her head and started petting her and said, "I am sorry." She didn't say anything and only nodded her head. Tatsuya petted her head for a while, and once he thought that Keisha was back to normal, he stopped. He then looked at her seriously and said, "I have checked Ingvild's body during the course of week, and there have been no problems yet seen with her condition. But I cannot say the same for the other patient, because the reason for her improvement is mostly because of her sacred gear." Keisha also turned serious and then said, "I understand. I will not blame you for anything. Even if you improve her condition a bit, we would be really grateful to you." Tatsuya nodded in response. She then looked confused and asked, "By the way, what sacred gear does Ingvild possess?" Tatsuya looked at her with a deadpan expression and said, "Do you really think that I will tell you the information about my teammates?" When she heard that, she pouted and looked away. Tatsuya poked her cheeks and said, "Let's go and have breakfast." Even though Keisha was a bit angry, she still nodded her head and thought, "He makes me flustered so easily. What the hell is with this guy? Like, I will surely pay him back in future." Tatsuya smiled and thought, "Good luck with that," and then went to have breakfast with others. Once the breakfast was done, Tatsuya looked at the others and said, "Miyuki, Himari, Ingvild, and Kurumi, I will be going to the underworld today, along with the Keisha, to treat the other patients, so I allow you all to take a day off from training as well." He then passed an envelope to them and said, "There is some money here. You can use it as you all like." Miyuki then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Oni-sama, can I tag along as well?" To which Tatsuya shook his head in denial and said, "No, you can't. We are still not sure what are their intentions yet, and even if I trust Keisha a bit, but we still don't know what would they plan against us. So I cannot put all of your lives in danger." Ingvild then looked worried and asked, "Will you be okay? Your life would not be in danger, right?" Tatsuya then smiled at her, making her mesmerized, and said, "There is nothing to worry about. I will not be harmed, And even if the situation takes turn for worse, I can simply teleport back, or I can even destroy that faction. Tatsuya then looked at them with seriousness and said, "Listen carefully. If there's anything wrong here, contact me immediately. You all are my first priority after all." He then looked at Kurumi and said, "I am leaving you here, so you are the in charge. Make sure to protect them." Kurumi nodded and said, "You don't have to be worried, they all are self-capable, and if a situation arises, I will fight as well." Tatsuya nodded and then looked at Keisha and said, "Then let's go to the underworld now." Keisha then looked at him and said, "There is just a slight problem. You cannot travel with my magic circle because you are not a part of my master's peerage." Tatsuya looked back at her and then said, "You don't have to be worried about that. I can travel on my own. You just need to lock your location and I will teleport there as well." Keisha nodded and made her magic circle, and after confirming the location, Tatsuya made his as well. He looked at his team for one last time and then said, "I will be going now. Make sure to enjoy your day off and don't even think about touching my coffee jelly." His team nodded and said, "Make sure to come back soon." Tatsuya nodded and smiled at them, making all of them blush. He then looked at Keisha and nodded his head. Keisha, who saw him, nodded her head in response as well. Tatsuya then looked at his circle and said, "Underworld, here I come." And then both of them disappeared. Tatsuya and Keisha appeared in some sort of garden with their respective magic circles underneath them. Tatsuya then started checking his surroundings and saw a purple sky, a garden where they appeared, and a small mansion near it. Keisha then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Welcome to the underworld. We are currently in my master's territory, or you can also call it our home. Me and all of my master's peerage members live here." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Though I don't think that I have to remind you, but make sure if anyone from your side takes action against me, I will not stay still as well." Keisha also nodded her head and then sheepishly asked, "Can you at least not go too hard on them if they attack because of some misunderstanding?" Tatsuya then sighed and nodded. He then thought, "I have a feeling that they will definitely attack me now." Keisha then started walking and then said, "Follow me." Tatsuya didn't said anything and silently followed her. Once they reached the front of the mansion, Keisha turned towards Tatsuya and said, "Wait here." Keisha then walked towards the door and then pushed the doorbell. After a while, a voice was heard. "Who is there?" Keisha didn't took much time and said, "It's me." As soon as she said that, various noises were heard by the both of them. Tatsuya looked at Keisha, who looked back at him with a wry smile. Then suddenly the door opened and various people came out of the mansion. A blonde girl then stepped forward and grabbed Keisha's shoulders and then started shaking her and asked, "Where were you all this time? Do you know how worried I was?" Then an orange-haired young man stepped forward and said, "Stop that, Coriana. How will she answer if you keep on shaking her like that?" He then turned towards Keisha and said, "I am glad that you came back safely." While this was going on, Tatsuya was silently looking at them with a smile and thought, "She is a good family." Then suddenly two men, one with green hair and one with blonde hair, noticed Tatsuya and asked, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" This brought everyone's attention at him, and they all started looking at him curiously. Tatsuya simply looked at Keisha and said, "Explain the situation to your friends." Keisha was about to speak, but then a giant man who was practically made of rocks walked towards Tatsuya and said, "Didn't you hear? We asked you, what are you doing here? Answer now." Keisha then grasped everyone's attention and said, "Stop it, you guys. He was the one who helped me earlier. If not for him, I would not be able to return home." But then a silver armor-cladded person said, "So you mean to say that a human helped you overcome a situation which you, a devil, could not?" "I don't believe it. The human must have used some sort of magic on her." Hearing him, all the other males, except for the orange-haired one, gathered around Tatsuya. The girl named Coriana sighed and said, "Guys, I don't believe that she is under some sort of spell. Why don't you ask her first? It could also be a misunderstanding." But the same armor guy spoke again. "We will surely interrogate him, but after we restrain him first, we don't know what his intentions are yet." Then the green-haired guy pointed a staff at him and said, "Answer, human. Did you use any sort of magic on her?" But the stone guy stopped him and said, "Leave that for later." He then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Surrender now, and we will make sure that you are not harmed much." When Tatsuya heard him, he gave a tired sigh, and seeing him sigh, Keisha face-palmed and said, "So much for my promise of not making trouble for him. Those guys are now in serious trouble." Hearing her, Coriana looked at her with widened eyes and asked, "Is that handsome guy really that strong?" Keisha continued to look at Tatsuya and said, "See for yourself. It will be over soon." This made both Coriana and the orange-haired guy curious, and they too looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya then took his hand out of his pocket and then stretched them and said, "You know what? You just fucked up." Tatsuya then used his telekinesis, and all of them started floating in air, making them surprised. Tatsuya didn't let them say anything and then started revolving them around him at a very high speed, and then finally made them crash against each other and let them fall unconsciously on the ground. Seeing what Tatsuya just did, the remaining three were looking at him with amazement. Even Keisha was shocked seeing what Tatsuya just did. Tatsuya then looked at the orange-haired guy and asked, "You are not going to join Mr. Lion?" This made him shocked, but he overcame it quickly and said, "I have no such intentions. On the other hand, I would like to apologize to you on their behalf. They are still a bit immature." Tatsuya shook his head and said, "As long as they understand." Keisha then came out of shock and looked at Tatsuya for a while. Feeling her gaze, Tatsuya looked at her and asked, "What?" Keisha then pointed at the pile of bodies, her teammates, and said, "Didn't you say that you would go easy?" Tatsuya looked at her with a weird look and said, "Didn't I held back enough? What do you want me to do? Kick on their balls?" Hearing his answer, Keisha sighed and said, "Whatever. It was their fault to begin with, but please hold back a bit more the next time they fight you." Tatsuya gave an annoyed sigh and thought, "I will crush their balls the next time they decide to attack me without any reason." After helping the unconscious comrades, Keisha, Coriana, and the orange-haired guy made way towards Tatsuya. The orange-haired guy bowed a little and said, "I am Regulus the pawn of my master Serog Bale, and once again I apologize to you on their behalf. I hope you do not hold a grudge against us." Tatsuya waved his hand and said, "You don't have to apologize again. My name is Tatsuya Shiba. I hope we get along in the future." The guy also nodded his head and said, "I hope so as well." And they both shook their hands. Then the blonde girl besides Keisha came forward and said, "Nice to meet you. I am Coriana Andrilphus, Serog-sama's bishop. I hope we get along well. Are you Keisha's boyfriend?" Hearing this, Keisha blushed and glared at Coriana and said, "WW, what are you saying? We are not like that." But Tatsuya stepped forward and looked in her eyes, making her look back in his eyes as well. Keisha was mesmerized by him, but then came out of it when Tatsuya said, "Why are you being shy to tell her about our relationship? She is your friend, right?" Coriana's eyes then shined, and she looked at Keisha and said, "Really, Keisha got herself a boyfriend? Now that's interesting." Keisha snapped and said, "There's no such thing like that. He is not my boyfriend." Tatsuya then placed a hand on her shoulder and said, "Don't be shy. You know, Coriana, during the whole time she was at my place, I fed her all her meals with my own hands. We even slept in the same room." Hearing him, Keisha's forehead was twitching and she shouted, "That was because I was unable to eat myself because of my broken hands. And you stayed in the same room because you had to healing vialed." Tatsuya just smiled and said, "Your flustered expression is really cute." And Keisha immediately blushed. Tatsuya then turned to the other two and said, "Now, jokes aside, I would like to do my work soon. So if it is not a trouble, can I meet your king?" Both Regulus and Coriana became a bit serious and asked, "What business do you have with Serog-sama?" Hearing the question, Keisha also came out of her stupor and said, "I will explain it all. Once we see Master, it would also be better to explain all of them together," while pointing at the corpses, her friends. Coriana and Regulus nodded and said, "Okay then, follow us." Tatsuya nodded and started following them while lifting the corpses with his telekinesis. Walking in the large hallway, they encountered some maids and butlers on the way, who respectfully bowed on seeing the peerage members, while also looking weirdly at Tatsuya and the floating corpses. After walking for a while, Tatsuya and the others reached a room with a large door. Regulus then stepped forward and knocked on the door. Soon a voice saying, "Who?" was heard, and Regulus calmly said, "Master, it's me, Regulus." Then a "come in" was heard. Regulus asked the others to wait and then went inside. After waiting for a while, Regulus came out and said, "You all may come in," with a nervous face. Seeing the nervousness on his face, Tatsuya used his telepathy to hear his thoughts and then gave a mental sigh. All of them entered the room, and no sooner did Tatsuya enter the room, he was welcomed by a fist. Tatsuya simply caught the fist and punched the person who attacked him, making him crash to the wall and successfully knocking him out cold. Tatsuya then looked at Regulus, who was looking at him with an apologetic expression, and said, "Sorry for such inconvenience. But as soon as Master knew that you beat all 5 of them without any effort, he became excited and wanted to fight you. I truly apologize for his behavior," and gave a deep bow to Tatsuya, followed by Keisha and Coriana, who were bowing as well. Tatsuya just sighed and asked, "Where should I keep them?" All 3 of them looked up and had a grateful look on their faces. After a while, Serog woke up and then clutched his stomach in pain. He then looked around and saw 5 members of his peerage knocked out cold. He then started thinking about what happened, and then suddenly stood up and saw Tatsuya and the others sitting on a sofa while having some tea. Tatsuya noticed him and then said, "You sure show some nice hospitality to others." Hearing him, the other 3 also looked at Serog and stood up and slightly bowed to him. Serog raised his hand and stopped them and said, "What can I do? I became so much excited when I heard that you beat most of my peerage with such ease. By the way, I am Serog Bale, the king of this peerage." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Tatsuya Shiba, nice to meet you." Serog then clenched his fist and said, "Tatsuya, you are strong. I will fight you again sometime." Tatsuya stared at him with a deadpan expression and then sighed and said, Sure, whatever. Now are you all still going to pretend to be unconscious?" All of them then looked at the corpses, who fidgeted a bit when Tatsuya mentioned them and slowly stood up with an embarrassed expression. Tatsuya then nodded and said, "Good. Now that all of you are conscious, kindly take your seats," and Keisha started explaining. All of them nodded their heads and followed his instructions. After Keisha was done explaining, all of them were silent, while Tatsuya was simply sipping on his tea. Serog was clutching his fist in anger and then smashed it on the table and said, "Those damn geezers," and cursed the higher-ups for trying to selling Vile, because of which Keisha got in danger. The others were also angry, but were controlling themselves. He then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, I am very grateful to you for saving my queen. If not for you, we would not be able to see her again. Thank you." Tatsuya waved his hands and said, "It's all right. More importantly, let's talk about the main business that I came here for. Keisha, if you may." Keisha nodded her head and said, "Serog-sama, you do know that the lady who was kidnapped along with me was also suffering from the same disease as Miss Lisama, right?" Serog nodded his head and said, "Yeah, that's why I sent you to check on her condition, because she was suffering from a similar disease like Mother's." Keisha nodded and said, "After we were rescued by Tatsuya, he said that he was able to heal her and did so a few days ago. She seemed to be back to her normal healthy condition, and I have witnessed this all from my own eyes." Tatsuya also nodded and said, "Yeah, she slept in the same room as me daily and saw me do it firsthand." Keisha heard him and blushed and said, "There is no need to phrase it like that so that the others misunderstand us." The others looked at them with a sweat drop, but then Serog got their attention and said, "So you mean to say that Tatsuya is capable of curing my mother?" Tatsuya then put his cup down and said, "Yes and no. I was indeed able to curing Vile, but that was only because her sacred gear was also helping. So while I could try to heal your mother, I cannot guarantee that it would be successful." Serog thought for a while and then nodded his head in understanding. He then looked at Tatsuya and then bowed his head and said, "Thank you very much for your cooperation. Even if it is a little, my mother still has some hope, right?" Tatsuya nodded and said, "Don't worry, I would try my best to save her. I know how important one's family is." Serog nodded and smiled. He then stood up and moved his hand forward and said, "Once again, thanks a lot, and let's get along from now on." Tatsuya stood up as well and shook his hand and said, "I hope so as well." Serog then looked at the others and said, "Okay, all of you rest for now, and tomorrow we will visit Mother in the Citri territory." When Tatsuya heard that, he thought, "Let's hope that we don't come across Sarah or Sona tomorrow. Otherwise, it would be way too much of a hassle to explain them, and gave a tired sigh. Keisha noticed it and asked, "What's wrong?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Nothing, just praying for my well-being." Keisha became more confused but didn't think much about it, and then started showing Tatsuya around the mansion. The next day, Tatsuya woke up early like usual and decided to do his morning training in the garden. As he left the room, he met with Sarorg, who also came from his room dressed in a training outfit. He looked at Tatsuya and said, "Good morning. I hope you slept well last night." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Good morning, and yes, I didn't have any inconvenience while sleeping." Sarorg then looked at Tatsuya from top to bottom and then asked, "You heading somewhere?" Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Yes, I was thinking of doing my morning training like usual." Hearing him, Sarorg smiled and asked, "Then why don't you join me? I was heading OU for training as well." Tatsuya nodded and said, "Lead the way," and both of them moved out of the house. Some hours later, Keisha woke up and got refreshed. She went to wake Tatsuya up, but didn't find him in his room. She then left to find the others, but they were not present in the mansion as well. She became a bit suspicious and then stopped a maid. The maid was running excitedly, but still bowed in respect. Keisha looked at the maid and asked, "Where are the others? Have you seen them?" The maid nodded and said, "Yes, all of them are out in the garden witnessing the match between Sarorg-sama and Tatsuya-sama. Many maids and butlers are there as well cheering them. I was going there as well." Keisha nodded, but was thinking, what exactly is going on, and immediately rushed outside. When she came out, she noticed a huge crowd consisting of maids, butlers, and the peerage members. She approached them and asked, "What is going on here?" Coriana looked at her and said, "Hey, good morning. As you can see, both of them are having a workout competition right now. That Tatsuya of yours is amazing. Push-ups, sit-ups, weights, anything. He beats Sarorg-sama in all of them. Right now, they are having a race of 500 laps around the garden, and he is still in lead. Geez, just how much stamina does that guy have?" Keisha looked towards the garden and saw a dust cloud following both of them. She looked at them in amazement and said, "Just what exactly happened to him?" Flashback. Tatsuya and Sarorg were simply doing their morning training, but suddenly Sarorg started increasing his pace. Seeing him, Tatsuya also increased his pace. Sarorg looked at him with an intrigued expression and then again increased his pace, and just like that, the process continued. Sarorg then looked at Tatsuya while both of them were running at inhuman speeds and asked, "Say, Tatsuya, want to have a competition right now?" Tatsuya looked at him and asked, "What sort of competition?" "Just a training competition, like who could do more sets, laps, or can lift more weights." Tatsuya looked at him for a while and thought, usually I would not get involved into these sort of things, but he then smiled and thought, using my body while putting limiters on it and having this type of competition sound fun. He looked at Sarorg with eagerness and said, "Okay, let's do it." Flashback, in Tatsuya looked at Sarorg and said, "You know, Sarorg, it has been a long time since I used my body this much." Sarorg looked at him and asked, "So how does it feel?" Tatsuya smirked and said, "It feels great," and started running faster. Sarorg looked at him with enthusiasm and said, "Not so fast. I am not done yet," and started catching up to him. Both of them then looked in front and saw Sarorg's knights holding a ribbon marking the finish line and started running faster. The maids and butlers were cheering for both of them as they had placed some bets on them. Tatsuya looked at Sarorg one last time and said, "Meet you at the finish line," and accelerated, making Sarorg left in dust. Tatsuya soon crossed the finish line, making some of the servants cheer loudly while the others looking down dejectedly. Tatsuya soon stopped and sat on the ground. He was completely drenched in sweat and was breathing heavily, but still was feeling very happy right now. He has never experienced such kind of competition since he came to this world, and it was certainly a new experience for him. Suddenly, he was covered by a person's shadow, and he looked up, only to find Keisha looking at him. She passed him a bottle and asked, "You sure look like you are enjoying yourself here." Tatsuya caught the bottle and drank a large gulp of water from it. He then looked at Keisha and said, "I sure am. Sarorg is formidable. This is the first time someone was able to match my place in workout, though I had limiters on me." Keisha puffed her chest and said proudly, "Of course. What else would you expect from my master?" Tatsuya then stood up and gave the bottle back to her and said, "Thank you for that," and smiled at her, making her mesmerized. But she was soon brought out of her stupor when Saror came and put his hand around Tatsuya's neck and said, "That was a great match, you sure are great. It only makes me want to fight you right now," and moved his fist forward. Tatsuya's fist bumped with him and said, "Yeah, I enjoyed as well, but we have to postpone it for now. We still have to visit your mom, remember?" Saror sighed and said, "Yeah, I remember, but don't forget that we will fight later on." Tatsuya sighed and said, "Yeah, whatever. It is no use refusing you. You're going to fight no matter what I do anyways." Saror smirked and said, "You know it. Anyways, let's go and get refreshed, and then go to Citri Domain." All the peerage members then assembled around them, except Corianna. They all started looking for her, and then spotted her near the betting table, counting the money with a smile on her face. All of the peerage members started to look at her weirdly. Noticing the gaze, she looked at them and asked, "What?" Keisha stepped forward and asked, "You seriously place your bet on Tatsuya, not on Saror-sama?" Corianna just shrugged her shoulders and said, "Keisha, you are innocent. While betting only good perception works, not loyalty. I am loyal to Saror-sama, but I knew that Tatsuya would win after seeing what he did yesterday." Saror didn't give it much thought and said, "Whatever, let's just go inside." He then started to look for Tatsuya and found him being surrounded by many maids who were asking him questions while blushing. Seeing that, Corianna elbowed Keisha and said, "Your boyfriend is very—" Keisha snorted and said, "He is not my boyfriend," and then started walking away with the rest of the peerage. Tatsuya saw that and soon followed her, and once he reached her, he looked at her and said, feeling jealous. Keisha didn't said anything and just looked away. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and said, "How about you show me around the territory after coming back from the Citri Domain?" Keisha looked back at him and said, "You can ask any of the maids from earlier." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "But I want to go with you as I know you better than them. So how about it, just the two of us?" Keisha, who heard the last part of his sentence, blushed and said, "Looks like there is no helping it. Okay, I will show you around later." Tatsuya smiled at her and said, "Okay, it's a promise, then later," and walked away. Keisha kept looking at his back for a while, but then she felt someone holding her shoulder. She turned around and saw Corianna smirking at her and said, "Got yourself a date? Not bad at all." Keisha severely blushed at her statement. Seeing that, Corianna hugged her and said, "You are so cute," but then released her and said, "But we have to prepare you well, because to us girls a date is like war, where we have to strike down the opponent at the first glance." She then looked at her watch and said, "We will talk about it later, we are getting late." After getting refreshed and having their breakfast, Tatsuya and Saror's peerage decided to go to the Citri Domain. They rode a carriage and enjoyed the talk along the way. Once they reached the hospital, Tatsuya once again prayed to not meet the sisters and then went inside along with the others. Tatsuya then entered a room and saw a lady with brown hair lying on the bed. Saror then came forward and went towards her and said, "She is my mother, Miss LaBelle. She has been sleeping like this for the past few years. She hasn't even moved a bit since then." He then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, I beg you, even if there is a little chance, please save her. It pains me a lot seeing her in such a condition. I can do nothing for her other than pray, so please I beg you," and fell on his knees. Tatsuya then went towards him and placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You don't have to beg me. I will try my best to cure her. Just be calm. She would not like to see you like this when she wake, you know." Saror stood up and nodded and said, I leave it to you then." Tatsuya nodded and then went towards Misla. He then placed his hand over her stomach, closed his eyes, and started examining her body. All of his peerage looked at him intently, waiting for say his verdict. Soon Tatsuya opened his eyes and looked at them. The others looked at him as well, waiting anxiously. Tatsuya then sighed and said, "Her case is similar to Ingvild, so she can be cured, and it is also not as old as hers, so it won't take much time to cure her." Saror then gave a huge smile, but then looking at his dissatisfied expression asked, "Then what's the problem? Why do you look so displeased?" Tatsuya looked at him and said, "There is no problem there. It's just that I have to again sit for hours to cure her. It would be very boring." All of the peerage gave him a helpless look and didn't said anything. Tatsuya then sighed and said, "That's it then. So if any one of you has something to do then, feel free to do so," and then started curing her. He then looked at Sarorg and said, "Oh, well, by the way, before I forget, give me a few things first." Sarorg nodded and said, "Sure, Keisha, make a list and ask someone to bring them as soon as possible." Keisha nodded and did as she was told. Tatsuya told her the things which he needed and then continued curing Misla. Soon Keisha came back and said, "They said that they would be able to provide it by tomorrow. There's no problem with that, right?" Tatsuya nodded and said, "No problem." Few hours passed away with Tatsuya and others talking to each other, and most of the peerage leaving because of some work. Only Sarorg, Keisha, and Coriana stayed behind with Tatsuya. Sarorg and Tatsuya then went out of the room as it was the time for Misla to get changed and wear clean clothes. Sarorg then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank you once again, Tatsuya." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "You don't need to thank me. I have yet to cure her." Sarorg shook his head and said, "No, what you're doing for us is still too much. Is there anything that you want in return?" Tatsuya looked at him and asked, "Do you think that there is anything of importance that you can give me?" Sarorg looked at him for a while and smiled and said, "Guess not. Your eyes say that you're not a person who is in need of something. Still, if there is any time that you need my help, I will gladly help you even if I have to face my fellow devils." Tatsuya looked at him in amazement and said, "You are even ready to face your own people?" Sarorg nodded and said, "Yeah, I am ready to face them. Except for a few people, none of these people even looked at us when we were in need of help, so you who is helping me in my need is of higher importance than them." He then laughed and said jokingly, "Besides, it would be much more fun to fight beside you, because if you are in need of help, then the enemy would surely be strong." Tatsuya looked at him for a while and then said, "You know, you are an idiot." But he then smiled and said, "But you are not as much annoying as the other idiots out there." He then moved his fist forward and said, "Then I would be looking forward to you support in future, Sarorg Bale." Sarorg fist bumped with him and said, "Me too, Tatsuya Shiba." Soon the others came out and informed them that they were done. Both Tatsuya and Sarorg nodded and then entered the room, and Tatsuya again began his work. Time skip. The next morning Tatsuya was still curing her, but he could feel that she could wake up any time now. He then looked at Keisha and Coriana sleeping soundly on his shoulders. His forehead was twitching seeing them asleep. His shoulders were completely sore with both of them sleeping on them, but he didn't complain. He continued to cure her while also suppressing the cause for the disease. Soon both of them woke up, and Tatsuya looked at them and asked, "Looks like you two slept well." Both of them absent-mindedly nodded at his question, making him twitch his lips. He then formed 2 glasses of water and splashed it on their faces. Both of them were completely awake now and glared at Tatsuya and shouted, "Why the hell did you do that?" Tatsuya looked at both of them and said, "Punished for making my shoulders sore." Both of them then remembered what happened and blushed. They both then bowed in apologies to him and then went to change their clothes. Tatsuya sighed and continued to cure Misla. Soon both the girls came back and apologized once more. A few hours later, Tatsuya felt something change in her body, and just like with Ingvild, he started to increase the supply of magic through her body. Keisha and Coriana also got alert by this and started looking at him intently. An hour or so later, Misla slowly opened her eyes. Seeing her open her eyes, both the girls started crying silently, and Tatsuya, too, gave a sigh of relief. Soon Misla gained more control over her body and started looking around. She looked around the room and saw Tatsuya and the girls present in the room. Tatsuya helped her sit up and asked, "Are you feeling well? Are you feeling uncomfortable somewhere?" Misla shook her head and said, "No, I am fine, but who might you be?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Oh, where are my manners? Let me introduce myself. I am Tatsuya Shiba, a human. I am Sarorg's friend who came here to cure you, Misla-san." As soon as she heard Sarorg's name, her eyes widened, and she said, "Era, so you are Sarorg's friend? Where is he? Can I see him?" Tatsuya was about to answer, but suddenly the door burst open and Sarorg came and shouted, "Mother, and immediately rushed towards the bed and was about to give her a bear hug, but was suddenly met with a fist on his face, sending him flying to the wall. Tatsuya looked at him and shouted, "She has just woken up. Don't cause such disturbance here. You were about to crush her right now." Seeing her son fly away, Misla looked at Tatsuya with widened eyes. Tatsuya looked at her and bowed his head and said, "I apologize for that, but you are still not in a condition to receive bear hugs right now." Misla waved her hands and said, "You don't have to apologize. I was just a bit surprised by it, that's all." Tatsuya nodded and then started to cure her soreness. Sarorg then looked at his mother while a single tear fell from his eyes. He then went towards her and was about to hug her, but first looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who understood what he was asking, sighed and said, "Don't use too much force. She is still recovering." Sarorg nodded and hugged his mother. He then separated from her and looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank you, Tatsuya, truly thank you. I cannot express just how much grateful I am to you right now." Tatsuya sighed and said, "You don't have to worry about that. Didn't we talk about it before? Just relax and talk to her to lighten her mood as well. She must be willing to hear about you." Misla smiled at Tatsuya and then looked back at Sarorg, who nodded his head and started talking to her. He then looked at Sarorg and asked, "Have the things that I asked for arrived yet?" Sarorg shook his head and said, "No, but it will be arriving soon. They will bring it here directly," and then continued to talk to her mother. Soon the door of the room opened, and a person came with the things that Tatsuya requested. Tatsuya turned towards the person, and as soon as their eyes met Tatsuya, became speechless and immediately turned around. The person was a girl around his age with black hair. Sarorg looked at the girl and said, "Oh, Sona, welcome. Why are you here, if I may ask?" Sona came out of shock and looked at Sarorg and said, "Hello, Sorg-san. I am here to deliver the things that you asked for, as most of the people working here are busy today." She then walked towards Tatsuya and put a hand on his shoulder and said, "But I am wondering, what are you doing here, Tatsuya-san?" Tatsuya slowly turned around and looked at her with a smile and said, "Just doing some deliveries. They ordered some food, so I came to deliver it." Sona looked at him and asked, "Oh, you came to do delivery in Underworld, huh?" Tatsuya continued to smile and said, "You came here to deliver the stuff, right? Can you give it to me?" Sona gave the stuff that he ordered and glared at him and said, "We will talk about this in detail later." Tatsuya nodded and thought, "Why is my luck so bad? Is there anything that can still go wrong?" As soon as he thought that, a magic circle appeared in the room and two people came out of it. One was a twin-tailed magical girl, and the other was a girl around Sona's age with straight long black hair. Seeing them, Tatsuya mentally groaned. The long-haired girl looked at Sona and said, "Sorry, Sona-sama, I tried my best, but I was still unable to stop her from coming here." Then the magical girl hugged Sona and said, "Sotan One-chan is here. Were you missing me?" Her gaze then landed on Tatsuya, and she asked in a surprised tone, "Tatsuya-chan, what are you doing here?" Tatsuya was massaging his temples, looked at her, and said, "Hi, Sarah. I am busy right now. I will explain you later." Sarah Fall wanted to ask more, but seeing the other, she stopped, but decided to interrogate him properly. While she was thinking this, Tatsuya was in his own thought. He was thinking, why are things going the other way I want them to go? So, well, at least nothing more will go wrong. Again, as soon as he thought, that a red magic circle appeared, and then a handsome man with bright red hair came out of it. The man looked at Seraphal and said, "Seraphal, save me. Graphia is making me overwork again." Then another red magic circle appeared, and a silver-haired maid came out of it. The maid looked around the room and saw the red-haired man hiding behind Seraphal. She went towards him and grabbed his ear and said, "Surzek-sama, you should not be lazy. There is still a lot of work left you have to do as a Mao." Then her gaze landed on Tatsuya, and she asked, "Tatsuya, what are you doing here?" Tatsuya, who was mentally crying, didn't said anything. He then banged his head on the bed in front of him and shouted, "Why the hell do I even open my mouth?" While Tatsuya's head was on the bed after his shout, all the people present in the room were looking at him. Surzex pointed at him and asked, "Why is a human here in Underworld?" Seraphal and Graphia looked at him and said unanimously, "Shut up for a while, I am trying to figure out that as well." Surzex was speechless and decided to keep his mouth shut. Tsubaki looked at Sona and said, "So that's your beloved Tatsuya, huh? I have to say he is quite handsome." Sona blushed on Tsubaki's comment and said, "He is not my beloved." Sarorg looked at his peerage girls and asked, "Why are two of the Maos and the strongest queen here, and how did all of them know about Tatsuya?" Keisha was also quite confused by all this, but when she heard Tsubaki and Sona, both her and Koriana, walked towards them and asked, "Sona-sama, can I inquire what is your relationship with Tatsuya?" Sona and Tsubaki both adjusted their glasses and said, "That is none of your business, I think." All four of them were glaring at each other. Grafia and Serafal looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Tatsuya/Tatsuya-chan, can you tell me what are you doing her?" They then looked at each other, and it seemed that there were some sparks coming out of their eyes. Grafia looked at Serafal and said with an expressionless face, "Leviathan-sama, there is no need for you to trouble yourself over Tatsuya. I can take care of this business on my own." Serafal smiled and said, "You don't need to trouble yourself, Grafia-chan. I can take care of Tatsuya-chan on my own. After all, he is my friend." Both of them continued to glare at each other, and then the room started to get colder. Misla was silently caressing Tatsuya's hair, thinking that Tatsuya was in a pitiful situation, and thought, "He sure is very famous, huh? Well, he's pretty cute/handsome." Tatsuya, who was now completely annoyed by their rambling, sit up, and then slowly turned his head and said in a cold voice, "Silence." All of them immediately stopped talking and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya also looked back at them coldly, making all of them shiver. Tatsuya stood up and said, "Stand straight." All of them, except Misla, straightened their posture immediately. Tatsuya took a deep breath and said, "Maybe you did not notice, but this is a hospital, and I am currently healing a patient here, so get the hell out of here." Surzex then looked at the patient, and his eyes widened. He then pointed at Misla and said, "How are yo dash?" Tatsuya then glared at him, and Surzex said, "Come on guys, let's move out. He is healing a patient now. We should not disturb him," and immediately left the room along with the others. Tatsuya then sat back on his chair and gave a tired sing and said, "Who the hell is fucking with my life?" He then looked at Misla and said, "Sorry you have to witness all that after waking up." Misla shook her head and said, No, there's no problem with that. I quite enjoyed it, but it looks like you will be a lot busy later." Hearing her, Tatsuya again placed his head on the bed and said in a muffled voice, "Why is it always me?" Misla smiled and slowly caressed his hair. Feeling the head pat, Tatsuya looked up and said, "Thank you." Misla looked at him and said, "Era, it should be me who thank you, not the other way around." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then gave her a pendant. Misla looked at the pendant and then pointed at herself and said, "For me." Tatsuya nodded and said, "It has some of my magic stored. It will suppress the cause for the disease, and in a few years you will be back to normal, but until then you have to wear it all the time. Otherwise you may suffer from the disease again." Tatsuya said that and yawned. Misla looked at him and asked, "Feeling sleepy?" Tatsuya rubbed his eyes and said, "Yes, I didn't catch a wink of sleep last night because of two idiots." Suddenly outside, both Keisha and Koriana sneezed. Misla chuckled and said, Era, then why don't you sleep for a while?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, it would be rude of me." Misla smiled and said, "But I don't have any problems with it, and it will be troublesome if the one who cured me is himself not well." Tatsuya wanted to reject her, but seeing her expression, which said, "You have to sleep no matter what," Tatsuya gave a tired sigh and said, "Then I thank you for letting me sleep here," and placed his head on the bed while still sitting on the chair. Misla looked at him and said, "You can sleep on the bed, you know." Tatsuya rejected her and said, "No, this is good enough for me, and besides, if others came back and see me sleeping beside you, there would be a bloodbath here." Misla thought for a while and then nodded her head. She then placed her hand on his head and started stroking his hair. Tatsuya, who was now receiving the head pat, thought, "Now I know why those girls like this. It is very relaxing," and drifted off to sleep. Meanwhile, outside, Sarorg and Surzex were sitting together, and Surzex was sipping on coffee. Sarorg looked at Surzex in worry and asked, "Surzex-sama, is it all right to let them be free right now?" Surzex sat back in a more comfortable position and said, As long as I am free from work, it doesn't matter to me. Besides, do you have the guts to intervene them? Sarorg looked at the scene in front of him and gulped. The four younger girls were having a fight with each other while being in their respective teams, and Graphia was having a fight with Seraphol. The whole area was either covered in ice or craters, making it look like a war zone. Sarorg looked at Surzex and asked, "Can I have a cup as well?" Surzex looked at him with a smile and said, "Here," and passed him a cup. Sarorg and the others later came inside Misla's ward. There was still some hostility among the girls, but they still decided to bear it for now. They all wanted to ask him some questions, but when they saw him asleep, they stopped. Surzex, who didn't catch the wind, was about to wake Tatsuya up, but as he was about to place his hand on him, his hand was grabbed by both Graphia and Seraphol, who gave him a cold glare. Seeing the glare, he immediately stopped and stood back and thought, "Who the hell thinks that a Mao is not scared of other devils?" They then started to talk to Misla, who just woke up, and asked her about her condition. Sarorg then noticed the pendant and asked, "Mother, where did you get that pendant from?" Misla took the pendant in her hand and caressed it and said, "Tatsuya gave it to me." When she said that, every girl in the room except Tsubaki looked at the pendant and then at Tatsuya. Misla chuckled and said, "He said that this pendant have some of his magic power and help it suppress the cause for my disease." Their gazes then softened a bit, and they then looked at the pendant curiously. Sarorg then looked at her mother and asked, "Does that mean that you are not healed yet?" Misla smiled at her son and said, "Yes, but Tatsuya said that I would be in perfect condition in a few years, but until then I have to wear it at all times." Sarorg sighed in relief and then looked at Tatsuya and said, "He really is amazing, able to cure a disease which even the best doctors and healers among the devils cannot heal in just a couple of days. Just what the hell is he?" All of them nodded and then start their talk again. Later, Tatsuya woke up and rubbed his eyes, and after he was completely conscious, he looked around and saw all of them present in the room. He stretched his body and looked at Sarorg and said, "Well, I have healed her. Just make sure that she don't take off her pendant and dash." He then looked at Misla and said, "Don't strain your body too much for now and make sure to get proper nutrition." He then quickly looked at the others and said, "Well, I should be taking my leave then," and immediately approached the door. But just as he was about to open the door, his shoulders were grabbed by someone. Tatsuya slowly turned his head and saw both Graphia and Seraphol holding him. He gave him a wry smile and said, "What happened?" Both of them continued to stare at him and said, "You are going to answer some questions first." Surzex looked at him and thought, "Looks like I will get some time spare because of him in future," and smiled. Sarorg looked at him and asked, "Why are you smiling, my lord?" Surzex looked at him and said, "Just picturing my beautiful future, that's all." Sarorg became confused and didn't said anything further. Tatsuya then sat on a chair, surrounded by all of them. He looked at all of them once more and then sighed. He regained his neutral expression and said, "There is no helping it. Go ahead and ask what you want, but dash." They all suddenly felt some pressure on them, making those who doesn't know about his powers widen their eyes. Tatsuya looked at them coldly and said, "Make sure that this conversation doesn't leave this room." All of them nodded their heads, but Surzex spoke, "Can we at least inform these things to the higher-ups?" Tatsuya thought for a while and said, "Only the Maos." Surzex nodded his head in approval. Seraphol then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Tatsuya-chan, since when were you a part of supernatural world?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Since before we met." Graphia, Seraphol, and Sona had a complicated expression on their face. Seraphol then looked at Tatsuya more intently and asked, "Then why didn't you inform me earlier? Don't you trust me?" Tatsuya looked at her expressionlessly and said, "You didn't ask, and besides, you're not in a position to accuse me, as none of you told me about you being a devil." All three of them looked down and didn't said anything. Tatsuya sighed and said, "And if I told you earlier, you would be pestering me day and night to join your peerage. That would be very annoying." Seraphol looked at him and pointed her finger and said, "Hey, I am not annoying at all." When she said that, all of them looked at her with a deadpan expression. Seeing everyone looking at her like that, she hugged Sona and said, "Sotan, they're being mean to One-E-chan." Sona tried to push her away and said, "One-E-sama, stay away. You are embarrassing me." Graphia then looked at Tatsuya and said, ignoring all this nonsense, I would also like to ask about your powers and how you are acquainted with Serog-sama. When Tatsuya heard the question, his gaze intensified at the mouths, making them shudder. He then said, regarding that, I would like to ask something first. He then intertwined his fingers and placed his head on it and said, you Maos must be aware of a devil named Ingviled Leviathan, right? Hearing the name Leviathan, all of them, except Serorg's peerage, became tensed. Seraphal nodded her head and said, yes, I know about her. She was a patient suffering from the same disease as Miss Lisanne, but went missing about a week ago. Do you have some information about her? Tatsuya looked amused and said, missing, you say? That's quite different from what I know. This time Surzex came forward and asked, then do you care to tell us about that? Tatsuya looked at him for a while and said, according to my information, she was kidnapped and was sent to the human world in order to be sold. When the devils heard this, they became shocked, and Serorg's peerage were angry again. Tatsuya then continued, but what I find interesting here is how can you devils not employ any guards or set cameras around her room, when you all know that the old mouth faction can come here to take her away? Don't you all find it amusing? He then stood up and walked towards the mouths and said, it's just like someone has done this on purpose, and the only ones I can think of who have such authority are the people who govern the Devil Society. He then stopped beside the mouths and said coldly, you didn't play any part in this incident, right? And imposed pressure on them. Hearing his cold voice and feeling the pressure surrounding them, both Surzex and Seraphal started sweating. Both of them were looking at Tatsuya in fear, but were still admiring his power. The others were looking at them with a confused expression, but Graphia, who was experienced with such situations, was shocked. When she saw the mouths sweating bullets in Tatsuya's presence, she was sure that Tatsuya was imposing pressure on them. She wanted to help them, but didn't she also want to know whether those two take part in the kidnapping incident, because she belonged to the old mouth faction as well. Seraphal then looked at Tatsuya and said, I swear, Tatsu-chan, I have no idea about such a thing. I only came to know about the kidnapping just now. Tatsuya used his telepathy in her thoughts and confirmed that she was telling the truth and removed the pressure from her. As soon as the pressure was released, Seraphal fell on her knees, breathing heavily. Seeing her like that, all of them got shocked, and Sona immediately went to her aid. Tatsuya then looked at Surzex and asked, and what about you, Mr. Redhair? Surzex gulped his saliva and said, I swear as well, I have no knowledge about such an incident. Tatsuya again used his telepathy, and after confirming, he removed the pressure from him as well. But Surzex didn't fell on his knees. He was just breathing heavily and was looking at Tatsuya as if he was a monster. Tatsuya didn't care about him and began thinking, so it's neither of them, huh? Then it must be either the other two or someone from the council. Most probably the councilman. Looks like I have to do some thorough investigation. Tatsuya soon snapped out and looked at the devils and said, oh, I do hope that you don't take it to your heart. I am sort of protective about my family. They all nodded at him, but then Surzex looked at him and said, wait, does that mean that she is with you right now? Tatsuya nodded and looked at Keisha and said, Keisha, if you may. Keisha nodded and started explaining them about the incident. After she was done explaining, all the devil were silent. Surzex then looked at Tatsuya and bowed his head and said, Tatsuya, I would like to apologize for all the troubles we have caused you, if there is anything that we could do for you. Tatsuya then waved his hand and said, I don't want anything, just make sure that you keep your mouth shut. They all nodded, and then Sona looked at him and said, Tatsuya, there is something I would like to ask. Tatsuya looked at her and nodded. Sona nodded her head and said, what powers do you have, and most importantly, what are you? Tatsuya looked at her and said, I am not telling you about my powers. That's a secret, and regarding what I am just a simple human. All of them looked at him and said, simple my ass. Tatsuya was taken aback by them and said, hey, that's very rude of you. Seraphal looked at him and said, there is no way you are simple at all. You can cure an almost incurable disease, make two mouths sweat under you pressure, and hide you presence to the point where we cannot even detect it. What part of you is simple? When she said that, the others nodded their head in approval. Tatsuya's lips twitched on seeing their actions, but he didn't think about it too much and sighed. He then stood up and said, "Whatever. I should go back now, it's already late." But as he said that, both Keisha and Sona came in front of him and said, "Wait." But Tatsuya didn't wait it and said, "Sorry, but we will talk later," and teleported away. Both Sona and Keisha looked at the empty space in front of them and thought, "I wanted to ask him what is his relationship with her. Well, whatever, I will deal with it later." As Tatsuya appeared in his room, he sighed and said, "Why do I feel like I just dodged a bullet?" After coming back home, he was bombarded with questions from all the girls, and he had to sit for hours to answer all of their questions. He even informed them about his confrontation with Sona and the others about his identity being revealed to them. He also told their identity to the girls and warned them not to tell about their powers. After answering all of their questions, Tatsuya decided to sleep, but when he noticed that the others were following him, he turned around and asked, "What do you want now?" They all said at the same time, "We will be sleeping with you tonight." Tatsuya raised his brow and asked, "And why do I owe this pleasure?" Kurumi came forward and said, "Do you even need any permission to sleep with us?" Tatsuya looked at her and then said, "No, you three are understandable, but why is Ingvild coming with you three as well?" All of them then looked at Ingvild, making her nervous. Ingvild then built up some courage and said, "What? I don't want to sleep alone when all of you are sleeping together." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "But are you sure? I will be sleeping there as well." Ingvild nodded her head and said sheepishly, "You don't need to worry about that, I can manage. Besides, you were the one who healed me, and I heard from others that you held onto my hand all the time while you healed me, so it's not a big deal." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then sighed and said, "Okay, you four on the bed, I will sleep on the floor." The others started to refute, but Tatsuya stood silent for a while and then said, "Look, it will not fit with me to make Ingvild sleep with us like that, so let's just sleep like that." They were still reluctant, but still nodded their heads. Seeing that, Tatsuya smiled and said, "In return, we can go on a date if you want." Their mood changed in an instant, and they hugged him and then went inside his room. Tatsuya then looked at Ingvild and said, "You don't have to force yourself to do what others are doing. You are free now and should do what you want. Even if you are in my team, you still have your own will. So just follow it." He then patted his head and then went inside the room. Ingvild stood there for a while and then put her hand on where Tatsuya patted. She then blushed and suddenly shook her head. After clearing her thoughts, she smiled and then went inside the room to sleep. The next day, Tatsuya woke up first and saw everyone clinging to him. Even Ingvild was there. He gave a tired sigh but smiled at them. He then went for his workout, and after coming back home, he found the others doing what they usually did. Ingvild and Himari preparing breakfast, while also teaching Miyuki and Kurumi lazing around in the morning. They didn't have to worry about school, as they all had started homeschooling and decided to enter in high school. After getting refreshed and having his breakfast, Tatsuya went for his work while leaving a shadow clone behind to help the others train, much to their dismay. Tatsuya had also given Ingvild a weapon because she has little to no physical endurance. Being a devil, and that too a descendant of a Mao, made her well worth in magic, and she only needed to practice her control as she had enough magic power. Tatsuya had given her an extensible lightning whip, Lucy's whip from Fairy Tail. The whip also had the ability to absorb any lightning or thunder attacks and use it against the opponents. It was a good match for her, as when combined with her water magic, it would be very effective. It was good for both mid-range and long-range enemies. It was also very versatile, as it could be hardened to form a rod or spear as well. For close range, she was being taught different martial arts. Tatsuya didn't work for 2 days, so he decided to work till the time the restaurant closes. After working till late in the evening, Tatsuya was about to close the gate, but when he came out, he met 2 people there, one man with black and blonde hair and one boy close to his age with silver hair. Tatsuya looked at the boy and said, "Oh, if it isn't my dear friend Valle. What are you doing here?" Valle looked at him, and suddenly rage took over him, and he grabbed his collar and said, "You, what the hell did you write in that letter of yours?" Tatsuya didn't said anything and smacked his head, making his face plastered in the ground. He then looked at the man and said, "And you must be Azazel, Valle's parent, right?" Azazel had a sweat drop seeing Valley on the ground, but he then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Yeah, I am Azazel, nice to meet you." Tatsuya looked at him and bowed and said, Sorry. Where are my manners? I am Tatsuya, Shiba Vala's friend. I am the one who wrote that letter to you." Azazel nodded and then looked at the restaurant and said, "Anyways, is this place about to close? We decided to use the coupon today, but it looks like we are a bit late." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "Well, I was about to close, but since Valley is a dear friend of mine, do come in." He then took Vala's hand and started dragging him. Azazel was again speechless, but simply followed him. He then sat on the counter, and Tatsuya made Vala sit on one as well. He then took a bucket of water and splashed it on him, making him wake up. Valley was completely drenched, and his eyes were covered with his wet hair. Tatsuya then moved his hair a bit to see his open eyes and said with a nod, "Looks like you have woken up." He then placed a menu in front of him and said, "Now tell me, what do you want to eat, my dear friend?" Valley groaned when he heard him. He then took the menu and then looked at Azazel and asked, "I can order anything, right?" Azazel looked at him and gave a thumbs up. Vala looked at Tatsuya and said, "Bring me the most expensive dish with the most expensive non-alcoholic drink, with the most expensive dessert then." When Azazel heard him, he choked on the water he was drinking and glared at Valley. Vala looked back at him and said, "El with a smug, you said that I can order anything." Azazel sighed and then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Bring me the same as him, just with the best alcohol that you have." Tatsuya then looked at him and said, "You sure about that? We have some good quality stuff, but can you handle it?" Azazel looked at him with a smirk and said, "Bring it on, kid. You are 1,000 years too young to challenge me." Tatsuya wrote their orders and said, "Wait for a while." He started walking away, but then turned to Valley and asked, "Do you want a towel to dry yourself up?" Valley shook his head and said, "No need," and then used his magic to dry himself. Seeing Valley use magic and in front of human, Azazel was about to reprimand him, but Tatsuya looked at him and said, "I already know. You don't have to worry, fallen angel San," and then went in the kitchen. Azazel was stupefied by the sudden development and then looked at Vala for answers. Vala looked at him and said, "What? Do you think that a normal human has the power to beat me to shit? It must be obviously clear to someone with your experience that he belongs to the supernatural world." Azazel was about to say something, but then stood silent at Vala's reasoning. He then looked at Valley and asked, "How strong is he?" Valley turned serious and clenched his fist and said, "He wiped the floor with me without even a scratch on his body. That's strong." Azazel's eyes widened at his answer. He then thought for a while and asked, "Does he possess a sacred gear?" Vala thought for a while and then said, "I don't know, but he was able to copy my divine dividing even the balance breaker. It was a perfect copy of my armor." When Azazel heard this, his throat went dry, and then many possibilities started to run through his mind. He then turned serious and asked, "Is he a threat to us?" Valley was about to answer, but then a voice was heard which said, "As long as you don't stand in my way, I will not do anything to you." He placed their food on their table and said, "But be on my bad side, and I can't promise that you will live long." He said that with a smile, but still released his pressure on them. Both Valley and Azazel were shocked and quickly nodded their heads. Tatsuya smiled and released the pressure and said, "Good then, if all that is over, let's have our dinner then," and placed his own plate on the table. Both Valley and Azazel were looking at him weirdly, but then they smelled the aroma coming from the food. They forgot all about the previous conversation and started devouring their meals. All three of them talked to each other while eating, making all of them to ease their tension. Azazel even offered Tatsuya to join Grigori, but Tatsuya simply declined, saying that he will not work under others. After having their meal, Valley and Tatsuya were looking at a passed-out Azazel who was mumbling something about his bedtime adventures. Tatsuya grabbed him by his hair and looked at his wasted face and said, "I told him that he would not be able to take it," and released him, making his face crash on the table with a bang sound. He then used his magic to clean up and said, "Now pay up." Vala simply took out Azazel's wallet and gave him the money and said, "Keep the change." Tatsuya looked at the money and asked, "What about the discount coupon?" Vala smirked and said, "Let's just say that I forgot about it. It would be a sight to see his reaction in the morning." Tatsuya smirked as well and said, "Make sure to send me a video as well." Vala nodded and teleported back with Azazel. At the same time, inside Azazel's dream. Azazel was having his fun inside his dream, but then he suddenly sneezed. The woman looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Azazel thought for a while and said, "Looks like something bad is about to happen to me. Oh well, whatever," and continued his fun. After the meeting with Azazel, Tatsuya and the others have started to train once again, as now their presence is known in the supernatural world. Tatsuya has now made their re-gym even more intense, making them more tired than usual, but the girls didn't complain. Miyuki and Himari were now used to it, and Ingvile didn't complain as she knew that right now she was the weakest link of the team. She was more determined than the others, and the fact that she was a descendant of the original Mao made her progress at a rapid pace. She is now at high class level, much to the surprise of the others. She now actively take part in spars against Miyuki and Kurumi, and even fighting toe-to-toe with them. Her control over her whip has grown to the point that she is able to handle any enemy under a 100-meter radius. She also uses it as a rod or spear as advised and demonstrated by Tatsuya. Her magic control has grown as well. Now she is able to manipulate countless snakes made of water and also able to form a barrier of water for protection. Tatsuya has also started teaching her a bit of lightning magic so as to complement her water magic and whip. Key manipulation and chakra control was also something Tatsuya started to teach her in order to make her body stronger and teach her how to fly without her wings. She also learned to strengthen her body using both ki and chakra. She can also use ki blasts, but they were nowhere as strong as Tatsuya's. At most, hers can crush a giant boulder. During all this time, Ingvile Bas also started to show her affection towards Tatsuya, but is not as bold as the other members of the Shiba house. Tatsuya, who has indeed noticed these things, does not try to remain aloof like most anime protagonists, and actively receive and show affection to her and others. Not many changes were there among the others. The only major change would be that both Miyuki and Himari were finally able to break through and were now low ultimate level. Their progress relieved them and Tatsuya a lot as they started to lose confidence because of their stagnant growth. Another noticeable thing was that Miyuki had greatly controlled her possessiveness to the point that she usually don't lash out on other team members and some other people who try to approach Tatsuya. She is still vigilant though, as she still protects him from random girls on the streets and other people who try to take advantage of him. She has accepted the fact that Tatsuya could not be bound to her alone, but still only the girls she approved could stay near him. Tatsuya and his team also have occasional meetings with the Devils and Vala's teammates as well. At one point, Ophis started to visit Tatsuya regularly. She would sit on his lap and made him feed her chocolates and other sweets, making the others jealous, but they did anything because they knew the power possessed by the lowly can destroy the world. Tatsuya also occasionally goes to the underworld along with his team. He usually go there to check on Misla's condition and whenever he was bored. He has also met Venelana Gremory and the other two Maos who came to visit Misla after her health has improved, and let's just say that they have a good impression of him. Surzex has also tried a lot to make Tatsuya and Rias meet so that he can intervene her marriage with Riser, but every time he tries to set them up, Tatsuya turns his offer down. In a desperate attempt, Surzex even asked him, "Tatsuya, why don't you meet my younger sister?" To which Tatsuya said, "I have heard about her from Sona, and from what all I have heard from her, she seemed to be a real piece of work and very annoying." Hearing the blunt but true evaluation of Tatsuya, Surzex's face twitched, but he controlled himself and said, "She is nothing like that. She's a very sweet girl, so why don't you meet her at least once, and whose words do you believe, her brothers or her friends?" Tatsuya didn't take even a second to answer and said, "Friends." Surzex's face twitched again and asked, "And why?" Tatsuya placed his hands on his shoulders and said, "As a fellow Siscon, I know that you can never say I'll about your sister to anyone else." His tone then got colder and said, "And why are you so desperate in making us meet? Are you scheming something?" Hearing this, Surzex immediately shook his head rapidly and said, "No, I am not." Tatsuya then smiled and said, Good then, if you were scheming something which make my family involved in it, then from tomorrow there would be one less Mao. Surzex paled on hearing this and thought, it's not worth asking his help. Let's just wait for the future and see. Sona and Serafal has also asked him to join their peerages, but were declined, but still Serafal tried it from time to time. Tatsuya also trains with the devils from time to time, but not as intensely like he practices with his own team. Seeing their practice, his team only thoughts were, who the hell is this person? Where is that hardcore training freak gone? He must be an imposter. And just like that, half a year passed, and right now Tatsuya and his team were getting ready to go to the underworld in Serorg's birthday. Though they were still humans, Serorg said that he has only called some people who were his or his mom's friends. Once everyone was ready, Tatsuya created a magic circle and teleported with everyone else. Once they reached the underworld, Tatsuya knocked on the door of the mansion, and after waiting for a while, a maid came to open the door. Once she opened the door and saw Tatsuya and the others, she smiled and gave a bow to them and said, "Follow me. I will lead you to the hall." Tatsuya and the others nodded and silently followed her. While on the way, Tatsuya thought, every time I think of something to not happen, it always happens. Let's try to think opposite of that. Today I will meet the Switch Princess. While he was thinking that, they reached the hall, and maid took her leave. Tatsuya, who was still thinking, was brought out of his daze when he was sandwiched between two people, and he thought, soft, and then looked at them and saw both Misla and Venelana there. He then moved back and said, "Sorry about that. Good evening, Misla-san, Venelana-san." Both of them did their afufu chuckle and said, "Good evening to you too, Tatsuya, Miyuki, Himari, Kurumi, and Ingvild." Misla then came forward and said, "Thank you for taking some of the time from your schedule and visiting us." Hearing her, Tatsuya gave a wry smile and said, "You are still upset for not coming here more frequently, Misla-san." She just smiled and said, "There is nothing like that, and besides, for Tatsuya and his work is more important than us." Tatsuya gave a tired sing and said, "I will try to find time to come here more often." Soon Serorg and came with his peerage along with Sona and Tsubaki. Seeing them, Tatsuya and the others moved towards them and said, "Happy birthday, Serorg." Serorg, who saw them, became happy and immediately put his hand around Tatsuya's neck and said, "Thanks, you guys. Say, Tatsuya, today you will not reject my request of sparring with you, right?" Hearing him, all the people present there gave a tired sigh and said, "He never changes." Tatsuya looked at him and said, "Okay, I will fight you once the party is over, and here your gift." Serorg smiled and took the gift and said, "Shall I open it now?" Tatsuya shrugged his shoulders and said, "Your wish." Serorg hurriedly opened the gift, and seeing his antics, all of them smiled, and it was to be expected, as it was the first birthday that he was celebrating with his friends and family, as before his mother woke up, he didn't organize such events. Once the box was opened, there were different bands present in the box. All of them looked at the bands intently, and Tatsuya said, "Those are some training band which can help you in training. You can change their gravity according to your will without affecting your whole body weight. You can change the gravity up to 10 times the gravity of Earth. I use similar bands as well, though mine can increase the gravity up to 500 times that of Earth." Serorg's eyes were now shining on seeing the band, and he bear-hugged Tatsuya and said, "This is the best gift ever." Tatsuya, who was being crushed by the HIG side, but smiled later and said, "I am glad that you liked it." Tatsuya then heard Sona and Venelana talking. Sona looked at Venelana and asked, "Oba-san, is Rias not coming?" Venelana gave a sad smile and said, "Sorry, Sona dear, she had a fever, so she is unable to visit today." Sona gave an understanding nod and thought, "Great. Now she won't learn about Tatsuya. I was kind of worried about their meeting, but it seems like that it will not happen anytime soon." Tatsuya, who heard this, thought, Hoo, my plan worked. I don't have to worry about it dash." Just as he was about to continue thinking, a bright orange magic circle formed in the room with fire coming from it. Seeing the circle, all of them looked at each other, and Tatsuya thought, "Why does my situation change from bad to worse?" The circle continued to glow for some time, and after a while the flames dispersed, and 3 people stood there. One was a beautiful woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, Another small girl who looked like her daughter with similar features, but her hair were done in form of drills, and finally a man with similar blonde hair and a handsome face. Misla came forward and bowed a bit and said, "Greetings, Phoenix-san. I am very grateful that you decided to grace us with your presence." The woman also came forward and said with a smile, "Don't be too stiff, Misla. You could just call me by my name, my friend." Misla also smiled and said, "As you wish, Jessica." Jessica then came closer to Misla and hugged her and said, "I'm glad that you were able to recover. How is your health now?" Misla separated from the HIG and said, "I've been quite good. Thanks for your kindness." The women then went to the side to talk to one another, and both the boy and the girl went towards Tatsuya and the others. The girl then came forward and gave a polite bow to the others and said, "Nice to meet you. I am Ravel Phoenix from the House of Phoenix, and the one beside me is my brother Riser Phoenix." Riser looked at the others with his hands in his pockets and nodded his head, but then his sight fell on Tatsuya. Tatsuya also looked back at him and then looked away. Riser then pointed his finger at Tatsuya and asked, "What is a human doing here?" Hearing his question, Ravel also looked at him curious. Saror came forward and said, "Good evening, Riser-san. I am Saror Bale from the House of Bale. This person here is my friend Tatsuya." Tatsuya nodded his head and said, "Nice to meet you. I am Tatsuya Shiba." Riser then looked at him with a smirk and said, "A human like you must feel proud that you are standing in presence of the great Riser-sama." When he said that all of them had the exact same thought, this person is very annoying. Riser's gaze then fell upon Kurumi, and he licked his lips and approached Kurumi. Kurumi looked at him and asked, "What?" Riser looked at her with an arrogant expression and said, "Woman, you are beautiful. Why don't you become Riser's woman?" When he said that, all of them again had the same thought. Great, he speaks in third person as well. Kurumi gave him a smile and said, "Sorry, but I already like someone else." Riser seemed to get a bit pissed at this, and then grabbed her hand and said, "I was not asking you. I was ordering you to be my woman." But suddenly his hand was grabbed by someone. He then looked at the person holding his hand and found it to be Tatsuya. Tatsuya gave him a cold glare and said, "I will say this just once, release her hand." But Riser, who had his holier-than-thou personality, snorted and said, "Release me at once, or you will die by my hands, human." Tatsuya didn't answer him, and suddenly Kurumi's hand was freed, and Riser's whole body disintegrated in flames, only to form back a couple of seconds later. Tatsuya continued to look at him coldly and said, "I told you." Riser then became more pissed and fired his flames at him without caring about the people nearby. Tatsuya immediately pushed the others away using his telekinesis and himself got engulfed in flames. Seeing him engulfed in flames, Ravel got panicked as he saved her from his brother's attack. Though she could not get hurt because she herself was a phoenix, but still he saved her. She then looked at others and got more shocked. The others who saw Tatsuya getting engulfed in flames thought, "Riser is a goner now." They all then looked at each other and then all said simultaneously, "Want to bet on how much time will he take?" Ravel then went towards them and said, "Are you all out of your minds? Your friend just died, and you all are betting. How can you call him your friend?" The others only gave her a helpless look, and then Miyuki came forward and said, "Rather than Oni-sama, you should be worried about your brother instead." Ravel became confused, but then the flame surrounding Tatsuya dispersed. All of them looked at him, and both Riser and Ravel were very surprised on seeing him unscathed, thought his upper body was completely exposed because his clothes were burnt. Tatsuya looked at himself and said, "Man, that shirt was brand new." He then looked at Riser and said, "Let's leave that for later and continue what we were doing." Tatsuya smirked at Riser, making him more pissed. Tatsuya then felt that everyone was looking at him, mostly girls. He then looked at them and saw them looking at him with a blush. He even saw Coriana taking pictures of him. Not minding them, he looked in the front and saw Riser making huge fireballs. Riser was about to fire them, but Tatsuya negated them and said, "No fire inside the house," and then rushed towards him. Riser covered his fist with fire and started attacking him and said, "Riser will kill you and will then make that bitch Riser's slave." Tatsuya intercepted his fists with his own. His eyes then changed into Byakugan, and he then used gentle fist art to press his pressure points and paralyzed him. Being paralyzed, Riser glared at Tatsuya and said with difficulty, "What did you do to Riser?" Tatsuya smiled at him, but then the smile from his face vanished and he said, "What happened? Can't move your body." He then moved closer to him and then activated his Sharingan and used Tsukiyomi on him. After getting out of Tsukiyomi, Riser looked at Tatsuya with fear in his eyes and said, "Release Riser this instant." Tatsuya scoffed and said, "Still arrogant, heh. Looks like I need to teach you thoroughly." Tatsuya then held Riser's body up with his telekinesis and then covered his fist with a Majin Breaker and started punching Riser while shouting, "Ore, ore, 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 ore. The other who saw this scene were horrified. Each punch of Tatsuya was making a massive shockwave, and just imagining them to be in Riser's place made them shudder with fear. Tatsuya stopped punching for a bit and then looked at Riser's face. Riser's eyes were lifeless. He looked at Tatsuya and asked why Riser's body is not regenerating. Riser is immortal. Riser cannot be defeated by the hands of a lowly human like you. Tatsuya's hand, then covered with black and white lightning, making a loud noise, Chidori with holy and black lightning. Tatsuya then looked at Riser with cold eyes and said, "You say you are immortal, huh? So how about it? Want to experience dying once?" Tatsuya then moved his hand back and then attacked directly towards Riser's heart. But just as he was about to stab him, he stopped. He then looked at the person in front of him and the other person trying to stop his hand. He then said, "Miyuki, move out of the way." But Miyuki stood there. Tatsuya then started releasing more pressure and said, "Miyuki, I said, move out of the way." But Miyuki still stood there struggling in his pressure. Tatsuya then put his hand down and deactivated the black and white lightning. He then looked at Miyuki and said, "Why are you standing in my way, and can you leave my hand, Kurumi?" Ravel. Kurumi released his hand, but Ravel kept on clutching his hand. Tatsuya didn't give it much thought and said, "Explain now." Kurumi came forward and said, "I guess you have done enough." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "And why do you think so? I surely want to kill him right now." Kurumi shook her head and said, "It is enough, see he can't even move a bit and is gravely injured." Tatiana didn't said anything and then again formed the Chidori in his hand. Seeing the Chidori in his hand, Ravel clutched his hand more tightly and started crying. Tatsuya looked at Miyuki and said, "Move aside." Miyuki shook her head, said, "I will not move, Oni-sama." She then looked at Ravel and said, "Just look at her, even though she is constantly being hurt by the holy element in that attack of yours, yet she's not budging a bit, only to save her brother." Tatsuya looked at Ravel and saw all the bruises on her face and body. He deactivated his attack and looked at Miyuki and said, "Move aside." Miyuki still stood there and said, "Oni-sama, please stop. She's a sister just like me, and I know how would it feel to see my brother die in front of me." Tatsuya gave a sigh and said, "You leave me no other choice." He then used his other hand and moved Miyuki aside and then punched Riser. Seeing Riser get punched, Ravel immediately looked at her brother. As soon as Tatsuya pinched Riser, his body erupted in flames, and after a few seconds his body was back to normal. Seeing that, Ravel left Tatsuya and hugged her brother and started crying. Riser hugged her back and let her cry to her heart's content. Once she stopped crying, she left his embrace and looked at Tatsuya and bowed and said, "Thank you. Thank you for sparing my brother." Riser didn't said anything and just stood there in silence. Tatsuya sighed and patted her head, and then her bruises started to heal. Tatsuya then looked at her and said, "You don't have to thank me, Ravel. And I have to say you are very brave to stand in my way in order to protect your brother." He stopped petting her and then said, "Besides, who said that I spared him? Sticky fingers." At his words, everyone's eyes widened, and they looked at Riser, whose body immediately fell apart through various zippers on his body. Riser got shocked and then started to get panicked. He then glared at Tatsuya and said, "What did you do to Riser's body, human?" Everyone got surprised once again on seeing that Riser was still alive and talking. Tatsuya then moved forward and then took a part of his body and attached it to his head. When everyone saw Riser, the girls covered their eyes and the boys started laughing. Riser looked up and then got angry and shouted, "Why did you join my dick there?" Tatsuya started laughing as well and said, "Now you are literally a dickhead." Ravel, who saw his brother's body parts, looked at Tatsuya and asked, "We'll be back to normal?" Tatsuya patted her head and said, "Of course he will," and rejoined his body. Riser checked his body and said, "Everything is fine, but why the hell is my dick still here?" While Riser was making a fuss about his dick, Misla and the other ladies came back. Seeing them enter, Tatsuya made the dick invisible. Riser then looked towards the door and saw her mother there and immediately went towards her. Jessica saw her son coming towards her and sighed, knowing that he must have made a ruckus. Riser approached his mother and was about to speak out loud, but stopped and came closer to her ear and whispered in her ear. After saying his problem, he moved back. His mother looked at him weirdly and said, "Riser, I know you are a dickhead, but you should not take it seriously and say that you are literally a dickhead. I guess you should go home and rest." Hearing his mother, Riser slumped in sadness and was about to cry, but then he suddenly noticed something. He then moved his hand down and found his little brother present there. He glanced towards Tatsuya, who nodded his head. Tears of happiness came at the corner of his eyes, and he immediately rushed towards Tatsuya and hugged his legs and started saying him thank you and all. But soon realization hit him, and he immediately stood up and said, "Why is Riser thanking you? It is because of you that Riser suffered from that." He then curled up his fist to hit Tatsuya, but as soon as he made his fist, he crouched down in pain and shouted, "Ah!" Seeing him in pain, the others got surprised, especially Venelana and Jessica, as they were seeing his power for the first time. Riser then looked at Tatsuya and asked, "Why is Riser suffering from pain?" Tatsuya looked at him and said, "See your palms." Riser followed his instructions and opened his fist and frowned. In his hands, what Riser saw was one of his balls on each hand. He looked at Tatsuya pleadingly, who only looked away. After the party was over, Tatsuya fixed Riser's body back to normal, and Riser immediately returned home. His mother, who has come to know of the ordeal, apologized for her son's actions, to which Tatsuya also apologized to her for taking such actions. After all that was over, Sarorg rushed towards Tatsuya and said, "Now since the party is over, let's fight." Tatsuya gave an annoyed sigh but still followed him along with the others. Soon Sarorg and Tatsuya were in a training field, and all the others were sitting at the sides. Tatsuya then looked at Sarorg and said, "You should use Mr. Lion as well so as to make the fight more interesting." Sarorg, who heard him, became shocked, but soon started laughing and then looked at Regulus and nodded. Regulus also nodded his head and came beside Sarorg. Sarorg then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, be prepared, our combined force will prevail against you." Regulus then transformed into a golden lion, surprising the others, except his peerage and Tatsuya. Tatsuya kept his hands in his pockets and said seriously, "Use your full power." Regulus looked at Sarorg, who looked back at him as well, and after a while nodded his head. "I will show him my true power." Regulus's body then began to glow, making everyone in the vicinity unable to see. After a while, the light died down, and Sarorg was covered in a golden armor and shouted, "Balance breaker, Regulus Ray Leather Rex." Tatsuya then took his hands out of his pocket and said, "Ready?" Sarorg pointed his finger at Tatsuya and said, "Tatsuya, I will defeat you with the power of the Lion King Nemia." Tatsuya narrowed his eyes and thought, "Let's use the power of a lion as well." And then Tatsuya's hands began to produce a blinding light. Soon the light died down and a golden one-handed axe was in his hand. He then pointed his axe towards Sarorg and said, "Then I will crush you with this divine axe Rita and will show you the power of the human that stands above all sunshine." As he said that, Tatsuya's body buffed up a bit, not as much as a Skaner, only just a bit. And Rita is also not as big as a Skaner's and is proportionate to Tatsuya's size. Seeing the axe, Seorg became more excited and then looked at Tatsuya maniacally and then launched towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya, too, didn't waited and punched him on the face, sending him flying, and said, "You should wipe that look off your face." Seorg, who crashed in the wall, stood up and said, "Yeah, that's what I expect from you. Now, come at me with everything you got." Tatsuya raised his axe and said, "Don't tell me that I didn't warn you. Cruel son." And a small ball of fire started forming over the axe and continued to get bigger and bigger. The temperature around the field also started rising, making it very uncomfortable for the others. Seorg was sweating heavily, but was still excited. The audience were also sweating, and their clothes have started to get burned as well. The most surprised were Ravel and Jessica, who were feeling hot as well, even though they were phoenixes. Miyuki and the others used their ice and water magic to cool down the surroundings, but it was of no use. Tatsuya looked at the sun and then at Seorg and said, "Here you go," and launched it towards Seorg. Seorg, being Seorg, didn't even try to dodge it, and took it head-on, creating an explosion. Tatsuya put his axe back and deactivated his sunshine ability and started walking towards the smoke. Everyone was looking at him curiously and were waiting for the smoke to clear. Soon the smoke cleared as well and revealed an unconscious Seorg and Regulus in human form. Tatsuya grabbed both of their collars and started walking towards others. He then handed both of them to his peerage. Tatsuya looked at the others who were looking at him with awe, and he said, "Why are you looking at me weirdly?" When they heard him, their lips twitched, and they all thought, "Who is the weird one between you and us?" Sona then came forward and said, "What was that axe you had?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "It was a big golden axe." Hearing his answer, her lips twitched, and she then asked, "What was the magic that you used before?" "It was a very strong magic." Her brow started twitching as well, and she said, "Will you answer me?" Tatsuya smiled at her and said, "I did." Sona asked when. Just now. This made Sona snapped, and she started cursing Tatsuya. Tsubaki immediately came towards her and restrained her so that she cannot attack Tatsuya. Not that she could. Tatsuya then looked at the others and said, "I guess we should leave for now. Girls, let's go back," and teleported away with his team, leaving behind an angry Sona and Ravel, who kept on looking on the place he was standing. The others' girls looked at her and thought, "Great, another one." While Jessica was filling a form given to her by Misla, which said, "Tatsuya fan club membership application." After the day of Seorg's party, a lot of time has passed by. All the devils who had met Tatsuya on Seorg's birthday came to his restaurant from time to time. Ravel also informed Tatsuya that Riser was very scared of him and daily checks whether his little brother is at the correct place or not. Venilana, Grafia, and Milikas also come from time to time to visit them. While on their visit, Tatsuya noticed a bruise on Venilana and asked about it, but due to her being hesitant about it, Tatsuya didn't ask her further and used his telepathy to find some answers. What Tatsuya came to know was that Zeoticus Gremory in this world was not an affectionate person like the one showed in the anime and light novels in Tatsuya's world. Though he keeps an image of a proper and affectionate Gremory in public, in actuality, he is very brutal and greedy. He was also the reason that Rias is currently Riser's fiancé, because he was after the power and wealthy of the Phoenix family. He has also tried to make Grafia marry Surzex after Surzex's original wife's death, because of her being a Lucifage and single. And when Venilana complained about that to him, she was then dealt by him. Tatsuya was way too pissed at this, but decided to take care of him later as he wanted to hide his capabilities as much as possible. He didn't said anything to Venilana and Grafia directly, but only told them that they were welcomed in his house anytime they want. Both of them understood what Tatsuya meant to say and thanked him. Tatsuya has also bought his publishing companies and opened many restaurants in various parts of Yasaka's territory. He also bought the studio who was making the anime on his manga, hence increasing his business a lot. And because of all this, his life has become way too hectic. The paperwork was fine as he was able to do that with the help of his shadow clones, but he still had to attend the meetings personally, as having him at more than one place simultaneously would have been suspicious. Tatsuya even renovated his house, and now it turned into a mansion. He did the same for his restaurant, making it more magnificent than before, and all that took him to do all that was nothing. He simply used his magic for renovations and used his powers to make the authorities not question him about the changes. Tatsuya also met Sikvera Agars when she came to visit Serorg in Underworld. At first, she was very distant to him and his team, but as the time passes and they met from time to time in the Underworld, her hesitation elevated and she started to open up to him and his team. Tatsuya also talks to her about different mechas, making her more interested and entertained in her talks. Tatsuya has also made the Hanging Gardens of Babylon his headquarters for his team. Though it is too big for them, he has no problem with it as it was very cool in his opinion. Though he is asked to not inform the others about their team's headquarters. Right now, Tatsuya and the others are in Underworld visiting Serorg as usual, and right now Tatsuya is in dilemma. Tatsuya was standing in front of Himari, who was looking at him with an expectant gaze. Tatsuya sighed and said, "You're saying that you want to meet your old friend who lives in Underworld." Himari nodded in response. "But didn't you say that your tribe abandoned you and your mother, and since then you have been wandering?" Himari nodded and said, "Yeah, that's true, I was abandoned by my tribe, but there's not only one tribe in the Underworld, there are many, and the one I'm talking about is the head of her own tribe. Even though she didn't took me in because of other people in her tribe, she still helped me a lot when I was younger." Tatsuya sighed again and said, "Okay, you can meet her, but make sure that you don't reveal your identity to anyone, and please don't get caught in some mess." Hearing him, Himari laughed sheepishly and said, "Actually, there is Dash." Tatsuya looked at her and said, "There is Dash." Himari didn't said anything and kept laughing sheepishly. Tatsuya sighed and said, "You don't know her location, do you?" Himari slumped her shoulders when she heard Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at her and said, "You know, in all possibility, she could be dead or be someone's servant right now. You too must be knowing about the current circumstances of the Nakomata tribe, right? They are currently being hunted. Do you still want to look for her?" Himari looked at Tatsuya with determination and said, "I still want to look for her, even if she is dead." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then stood up. Seeing him stand up, Himari looked at him and asked, "What happened?" Tatsuya stretched his body and said, "Gather the others, we're going to find a cat right now." On hearing that, Himari smiled brightly and then jumped on Tatsuya, who caught her only to suddenly get kissed by her. She then freed herself and then walked out of the room and said, "Thank you, Tatsuya. I love you." Tatsuya looked at the door for a while and said, "That was unexpected. Well, I enjoyed it, so no problems on my end." He then used his magic and searched all the areas in the Underworld to look out for the tribe. After searching for a while, he finally found it and thought, "Seriously, the only tribe I could find is under attack. How much of a cliché is this world going to be for me?" Soon Himari and the others came in the room. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "I found them, but we have to hurry. They are currently under an attack, so prepare yourselves." They all nodded, and then all of them took out their weapons. Kurumi, who was inside, Tatsuya asked, "Need my help as well?" Tatsuya shook his head and said, "No, at least not for now." They all then gathered near him, and Tatsuya teleported along with all of them. Tatsuya and the others soon appeared in a barren piece of land filled with craters. They all started to look around and saw many destroyed, makeshift houses, blood, dead bodies, and the one-sided fight between devils and Nakomata. Tatsuya looked at them and sighed. He then looked at his companions, and suddenly an idea came to his mind. "Okay, let's check whether you can hold yourself during a battle which requires killing or not. You three will take the enemies on that side, and I will take the enemies on the opposite side," Tatsuya said while pointing his finger. Tatsuya then put his hand down and said, "Furthermore, the one who killed the most number of enemies will get a reward." Hearing the word reward, all of them perked up and asked, "What reward?" Tatsuya smiled and said, "As long as it is acceptable, it can be anything you want." He then looked at the field and said, "Ready, go." As soon as he signaled, all three of them rushed at full speed while thinking, "Kill them, ALLO." Tatsuya looked at them and said, "I pity those devils who are going to face them." Suddenly Kurumi said, "Why not let me participate as well?" Tatsuya showed a deadpan expression and said, "I only want to destroy the devils, not the whole area along with them." Kurumi grumbled and started to complain in his head. Tatsuya became annoyed and said, "Fine, fine. I will let you sleep with me tonight, so keep quiet." Kurumi immediately stopped complaining and said, "I love you, Tatsuya." Tatsuya sighed and then looked at the girls once more and then left for his own battle. After Tatsuya left for his side of the battlefield, he came across a lot of corpses, both of the devils and the Nakomata. He looked at the bodies for a while and then thought, they really are twisted to kill the entire race just because of one of the members of their species kills a high-ranking devil. If I were to have that type of mentality, then the devils would have perished a while ago. He then looked away and then started walking again. After walking for a while, he came in front of a large group of devils, but before revealing his presence, he used a mask to cover his face like Kakashi. He came near them and said, "Yo." The people present there got aware of his presence and immediately looked at him. They all were confused to see a human there and were wary of him, but despite of that, some of the Nakomata were looking at him with hope. One of the devils pointed his finger at Tatsuya and asked, "What is a human like you doing here?" Tatsuya rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment and said, "A black cat crossed my path, so I had to turn around and take another path, and while walking the path, I reached here." All of the Nakomata and the devils were blinking their eyes while looking at him. Then the devil who was pointing his finger earlier snapped and said, "Do you really think that we would buy that crap?" Tatsuya looked at him with a displeased expression and said, "You didn't believe me, but Thess' words were used by a very great person, and I mimicked him perfectly. How can it fail?" Tatsuya then hit his palm with his other hand, turned in a fist as a look of realization came on his face, and he said, "No, wait, I remember now. He too was never able to make others believe him. Now it makes sense." While Tatsuya was doing this, the devil was getting more and more frustrated. Finally, not being able to bear the frustration, he charged at Tatsuya while shouting, "You worthless piece of shit, die!" But just as his fist was about to connect, he burst into white light and disappeared from everyone's sight, making all of them, except Tatsuya, widen their eyes in surprise. Tatsuya was standing at the place he was standing earlier with a silver gun in his hand and said, "You devils surely lack manners. Didn't anyone teach you that you shouldn't interrupt anyone while they are speaking? Sigh so much for you to live in an aristocratic society." All the devils looked at Tatsuya with hatred in their eyes, but none of them took any actions against him. They all now knew that Tatsuya was not a simple human and were now wary of him. Tatsuya looked at everyone present there and smirked. "You're not as dumb as I thought you all would be, considering most of you are nothing but arrogant shit. Now, then what I want to know, who ordered you to attack the Nakomata?" One of the devils who had been trying to suppress his anger finally failed and said, "Why do you want to know that? And who do you think you are to be asking questions to us? You are just a human, so remember your place. And if you don't know what is your place, then let me tell you, it's below my feet." Tatsuya looked at the devil with an amused expression and then swiped his hand in the air, and just after he did that, the devil's legs were cut off, making blood splatter around. Tatsuya then started walking towards the injured devil who was crying in pain. All the other devils looked at the scene in front of them in fear. They all wanted to help their fellow devil, but were unable to move because of fear. Tatsuya stood in front of the devil who was looking at him with fear in his eyes. Tatsuya then smiled and said, "Now what should we do? You don't have any feet now." Tatsuya then lifted his own feet and kicked the devil with some force, killing him in the process. He then checked the area around him and then said, "Let's call all the people here first." He then stretched his arms and used his telekinesis. Soon many devils and Nakomata flying in the air were coming towards him. He made all of them land safely and then segregated them in their respective groups. He then looked at the devils and Nakomata who just came here and said, "I give you all 5 minutes to explain what all is happening here to your friends who just came here, and be careful. Make any unnecessary moves, and you will dash." He smiled evilly while releasing some of his pressure on them, making all of them look at him in fear. All of them then began to discuss among themselves, and Tatsuya used his telepathy to hear what all of them were thinking. After the time was over, he clapped his hands to get their attention. All of them looked at him. Tatsuya then gave a fake cough and said, "Now that the time is up, I guess you all know what is the situation you are in." He then looked at the devils and said, I will ask without beating around the bush, and I expect you all to do the same as well. Who ordered you to attack the Nikomata? They remained silent and didn't answer him. Tatsuya gave a sigh and thought, why are they so arrogant to not understand how much of a deep shit they all are in? Tatsuya raised his hand and said, fine, have it your way, and fired multiple ki blasts on them. The devils who saw the ki blasts coming towards them got alert. They wanted to defend themselves, but were unable to, as the ki blasts were very fast. After getting hit by the blasts, they were engulfed in explosion made by them. Seeing the sheer amount of the destructive power of those blasts, the Nikos were awestruck. They were looking at Tatsuya and were hoping that he was not there to kill them. Tatsuya then moved towards the devils once the blast was extinguished. He looked at the pile of devils who were severely injured and said, I have not killed you yet, but I can't promise the same if you are unwilling to give me the answers. One of the devils, who was now very scared of him, said, you wait, I will tell you. We were sent here by the head of the Nibirius family. Tatsuya then moved his head close to the devil and asked, and what else did he ask you to do apart from killing them? The devil gulped his saliva and was not willing to answer, but seeing the key orb that Tatsuya made just then made him shiver, and he said, we are here to catch a Nekashu to aid him in his experiment. Tatsuya then looked at the Nikomata and asked, do you have a Nekashu among your people? The Nikomata were surprised by this, but still nodded their heads. Tatsuya looked back at the devil and smiled and said, see, it was not difficult, was it? Tell you what, I will give you a reward as well for answering my questions. Tatsuya then took a weird-looking white doll and placed it in front of the devil. The devil looked at the doll in confusion and asked, what is it? Tatsuya started walking back and said, it's my art. The devils looked at the doll, and one of them muttered, this is just shit. Tatsuya then turned around, immediately making the devil tremble in fear. Tatsuya just smiled and said, art is not shit, you know. He then raised his hand and said, art is explosion, and snapped his fingers. Once his fingers snapped, all the devils were engulfed in a massive blast, making the blast of the previous ki orbs look like child play. Tatsuya then turned towards the Nikomata, who were looking at him with fear, and said, I guess that said Nekashu must be you leader as well. They all hesitated for a bit, but still nodded their heads. Tatsuya nodded his head and said, good, take me to her. Meanwhile, at the other side, Miyuki, Himari, and Ingvild were killing the devils at great speeds, making both the devils and Nikomata look at the three of them with fear. One of the scared devils who was trying to run away was then surrounded by the three of them. Miyuki looked at the other two and said, back off, you two, this one is mine. Himari snorted and said, who decided that? Just go away and let me kill him. The devil, who was not able to bear any more, asked, why the hell are you killing us anyway? We didn't do anything to you, so why? Both of them looked at him and said, I know that we don't have any bad blood between us, but please die for the noble cause. The devil looked at both of them and said, what noble cause asks you to do this massacre? Himari then looked at him with a cold expression and said, says who kill the Nikomata without any care at all. Miyuki too glared at him and said, so by the name of Oni Isama die. But before she was able to finish, the devil was pierced a lightning spear by Ingvild, who said, this is a noble cause because it allows the winner to get a reward from Tatsuya, and by the looks of it, I guess I win. Seeing the victorious expression on Ingvild's face, the other two started to argue with her, making the Nikomata present their look at the with a weird expression. After Tatsuya asked the Nikomata to take him to their leader, they all dropped their heads down in sadness. Seeing them like that, Tatsuya sighed and said, seeing that how you all are feeling sad, she must have already been taken to their headquarters. He then sent a telepathic message to the others and told them to come there as soon as possible along with the other Nikomata. Soon the three girls along with the Nikomata came. Tatsuya nodded and then looked at Himari and asked, is your friend in this tribe? She nodded her head and then said, yes, she is here, or correctly saying she was here. I asked about her from others and came to know that the one I was looking for was indeed their leader, but as you may have already known, Dash. Tatsuya nodded and said, yes, she has already been taken by those devils. When he said that, the other members of the tribe started to feel guilty and were blaming themselves for their incompetence. Tatsuya sighed and stood up and stretched his arms and said, "Well, I'll be going for a while. In the meantime, treat the injured and help them to stabilize a bit. I will leave a clone here, just in case." After saying that, Tatsuya started flying in the Nibirius family's direction and thought, "I was planning of going there soon to collect evidence on Kuroka's innocence. Well, it only works in my favor. Himari gets to meet her friend, and I get an excuse for finding records for her innocence. A win-win situation if I say so." Soon he reached in front of a steel door, which looked like it was leading underground. Tatsuya's eyes then changed, and he said, "Kamui," before phasing through the gate without any hindrance. He also turned invisible and decided to give the devils a surprise. After casually walking in the underground laboratory for a while, he came across a room which, on his opinion, looked like a study, as many books and paperwork was scattered all around the room. He gave a sigh and made some clones and said, "Let's get on the work, boys," and started searching the room. After a while, one of the clone came towards real Tatsuya and showed him a marked page on one of the notebooks present in the room. Tatsuya looked at the content that the clone was asking him to go through and sighed. He then looked at the clone and asked, "Have you read all this?" The clone nodded his head in approval. Tatsuya then looked at him weirdly and said, "Then dumbass, just disappear and I will know about this." The clone twitched his lips and said, "We are literally the same person, so don't call me dumbass, you dumbass," and disappeared with a puff of smoke. Tatsuya then looked at the others and said, "Collect anything that looks useful. Don't leave any place unturned." The clones nodded, and all of them started searching the room thoroughly. After collecting all the useful things, Tatsuya dispelled all the clones and said, "Now let's search for Himari's friend," and started roaming around the lab again. He then used his detection and found that the scientists and some Nekashu were present in a lab, which was at a level more down than he was on. Tatsuya again used his Kamui and phased through the ground. After reaching the desired floor, he saw many guards present there, and after checking their strength, most of them were ranging between low class to high class and 2 ultimate class. Tatsuya just took out his guns and fired at any guard that came in his way, killing them without letting them make a noise. He didn't have to even worry about the dead body or leaving any evidence behind, as he was completely invisible. Even the security camera were not able to see through his invisibility. After walking a while, he came across a chamber and phased through it. Once he reached a door, he disabled his invisibility after destroying all the cameras. He then knocked on the door and shouted, "FBI, open up!" and kicked the door open. As soon as Tatsuya entered the room, he saw a group of 3 scientists quickly throwing a magazine away. Tatsuya observed the cover of the magazine and thought, "My entrance must have shocked them to hell while they were literally reading a book on little girls' adventure." One of the devil scientists then raised his hands and said, "There is no lowly magazine here." The other people looked at him and thought, "Seriously?" Calming themselves down a bit, a devil came forward and said, "Who the hell are you, and how were you able to enter without anyone noticing? Where are the guards?" Tatsuya didn't answer the devil and threw him away using telekinesis. He then moved forward and said, "There are 2 things that you all should know about the current situation. First, you are not the one who will ask questions. Only I will be the one doing that. And second, he then gave them a menacing smile and said, "Instead of thinking how I entered here, you should worry more about how you all will leave this place." All the devils shivered on hearing Tatsuya's voice, but still one of them came forward. The devil who came forward was wearing formal clothing rather than lab coat, and was also an ultimate class devil, while others were at most high class. The devil looked at Tatsuya and said, "Who are you, boy? Don't you know that you are invading in my territory? You sure have guts to come here, and alone at that. I will surely kill you, or better use you for one of my experiments." He said that while he pointed his finger at Tatsuya. Tatsuya looked at him for a while, and then fired a death beam which pierced his thigh. Tatsuya then walked towards the crouching devil and lifted him up by his hair and said, "Didn't I say before that I will be asking questions, not you? So what is your name, my shitty devil?" As soon as he said that, a magic blast was fired at him, which Tatsuya just slapped away. He looked at the devil who fired it, who looked at him with anger, and said, "You, leave Nibirius-sama alone." Tatsuya widened his eyes and then looked at Nibirius and said, "So you are the infamous NECA pervert Nibirius, huh?" When he said, Nibirius snorted at him, while some of the scientists were trying to hold back their laugh. Tatsuya then threw him away and then walked towards some huge glass tubes which contained then the naked Nekashu. The Nekashu looked at him with questioning gaze, to which Tatsuya just smiled. He then snapped his finger, and suddenly all the tubes got destroyed. The fluid contained inside the tubes started flowing out, and Tatsuya caught the Nekashu, who came out of those tubes. Tatsuya then looked at the enraged scientists and said, "Seeing that you have more than one Nekashu you are experimenting on, you all must have been the ones who have been killing the Nekomata." Tatsuya then looked back at the naked girls, and then his gaze moved towards their chest, and Tatsuya thought, "Big." He then averted his eyes and gave them some sheets to cover their body for the time being. He then looked at the devils and exerted some pressure on them and said, "I will be taking them back. You don't have any problems, right?" The devils wanted to retort, but Tatsuya was exerting too much pressure on them for them to even move a muscle. Tatsuya nodded his head and then looked at the girls and said, "Let's go then." Tatsuya started to move, and some girls started following him as well, but one of them didn't move. Tatsuya looked back at her and asked, "What happened?" The Nekashu had blonde hair and a voluptuous body. She glared at Tatsuya and asked, "How can we trust you so easily and follow you who knows that you don't have any bad intentions towards us?" Tatsuya looked at her emotionlessly and said, "Who said that you have to trust me, and I didn't even ask you to follow me? If you know the way to the DxD, you are more than welcome to go on your own, or you can even wait here with the NECA pervert and company as well." And then again started walking. The Nekasha looked at Tatsuya and gritted her teeth, but sighed and started following him like the others. After walking for a while, the girls started to feel a bit relieved and started talking to one another, and from what Tatsuya heard, he came to know that they all were the leader of their own respective tribes, and were brought here after their tribe was completely slaughtered by the devils. Tatsuya didn't said anything to them, as he believed that the world he was currently in believed only in the survival of the fittest. Once they all were out of the establishment, Tatsuya asked the others to move back a bit, and then materialized a sort of rifle and pointed it at the huge establishment. He started charging his magic and then pulled the trigger while saying, "Material burst." As soon as he pulled the trigger, a small orb formed over TH establishment and then started getting bigger and bigger till it completely engulfed the whole establishment and destroying in the process. The girls looked at the scene in front of them in horror, and they then turned to the one who was trying to argue with Tatsuya earlier and said at the same time, "You should be glad that I came back unscathed." After checking whether the laboratory was completely destroyed or not, Tatsuya went toward the girls and asked, "So what do you all plan to do from now on?" Hearing his question, the girls started discussing among themselves. Seeing that the girls were not going to reach a conclusion anytime soon, Tatsuya clapped his hands to get their attention and said, "Stop it. You all are coming with me to the Nekomata tribe I saved recently. You all can discuss further after we reach there." He then opened his arms and said, "Grab on." The girls hesitated a bit, but still took a hold of his arms. They have already seen his strength, and they surely don't want to annoy him at all. Once Tatsuya confirmed that all of them were holding his arms, he nodded and then teleported away. In an instant, all of them were in the area where Tatsuya and his team killed the devils. The others also noticed that he have came back and started to come near him. Once the Nekomata saw the blonde Nekashu, they all quickly rushed toward her and started to bombard her with questions and apologies. Tatsuya slowly walked towards Himari and asked, "Is she the one?" Himari looked at the blonde Nekashu for a while and said with a smile, "Yep, she is the one." She then looked at him and said, "Thanks a lot, Tatsuya," and hugged him. Tatsuya hugged her back and slowly caressed her back and said, "You don't need to be grateful to me. Didn't I say that I will help you any way possible when you join the team?" Himari smiled and snuggled closer to him. Tatsuya looked at her and said with a smile, "Besides, I will make sure to enjoy your ears and tail once we go back home as a compensation. So it is a win-win condition for me." Himari blushed on thought about what all Tatsuya would do to her, but Tatsuya suddenly said, "I am not going to do any of those perverted things that you are thinking about right now." Hearing this, Himari looked up while she was still a blushing mess, and with her ears dropped looked at Tatsuya, with puppy eyes, with some tears forming at the corner of her eyes. Tatsuya, who looked at her, took a critical hit and blushed as well. He hugged her tightly and said, "Himari, you are too cute." Himari, who heard him, was happy and again snuggled closer to him. While this was going on at the side, both Miyuki and Ingvild were looking at Tatsuya and Himari, who seemed to have made their own temporary world for now. Miyuki kept looking on them and said, "Should we start wearing animal ears as well?" Ingvild, who heard the question, still kept on looking at them as well and said with a nod, "We should try it. It looks like they would be very effective on him." Ingvild and Miyuki both looked at each other and then shook their hands, forming an alliance. After a while, all the Nakomata and Nekishu gathered around Tatsuya, and the others indeed bowed their heads and said, "Thank you very much for saving us from those devils. We would be forever grateful to you." Tatsuya shook his hand and said, "You don't need to be grateful to me. I only did this because my friend Himari had someone she wanted to meet, and there was a chance that her friend would be among you all. So if you want to thank someone, it should be Himari." Tatsuya noticed that when he took Himari's name, the blonde-haired Nekishu's eyes widened. The blonde then came forward with a shocked expression, and seeing that Himari came forward as well. The blonde looked at Himari and asked, "Are you Himari?" Himari smiled and said, "Long time no see, Isumi." Hearing that, the blonde started to cry and hugged Himari while saying, "Sorry," over and over again. Himari smiled and started to console her, and after she stopped crying, they started to talk to each other. At the same time, the other Nekishu and Nakomata started to discuss about what to do from now on. On the other hand, Tatsuya, Miyuki, and Ingvild were sitting in a corner with Tatsuya being in the middle of them. Tatsuya and the girls looked at the scene in front of them, and Tatsuya unconsciously said, "There are a lot of cats here for sure." Ingvild nodded her head and said, "There sure are." Miyuki glared at the Nikos and said, "Should I take care of some of those future thieving cats, Oni-sama?" Both Tatsuya and Ingvild looked at Miyuki with a swear drop. Tatsuya decided to change the topic and said, "By the way, who won the competition among you three?" At his question, Ingvild beamed with happiness and hugged him tightly. Seeing the reaction, Tatsuya looked at Ingvild with a smile and said, "Good job, Ingvild. It looks like you're getting better and better getting a hold on your power. I am really proud of you." Ingvild smiled sheepishly on hearing Tatsuya's praise and nodded her head. Tatsuya had already told her that she was a powerhouse, having a power equal to, if not greater than, a superclass devil. But having power and being able to use it were two different things. She was not able to properly control her power, so instead of increasing her power like Miyuki and Ingvild, she focused on controlling her already massive power. Tatsuya then noticed the gloomy atmosphere around Miyuki and patted her head and said, "Don't be sad. Losing now only means that you have to leave your opponent in dust when the next time you compete with her, understood?" Miyuki, who was in bliss because of the head pat, nodded her head and said, "Yes, Oni-sama." Tatsuya smiled at her, but suddenly his expression turned serious. Tatsuya stood up and looked at the Nikos, still talking to each other. Tatsuya went towards them and said, "I don't want to interrupt you all, but it looks like the Nekka pervert survived somehow and is now coming here with his army." Hearing his words, the Nikos stopped talking and immediately checked their surroundings using Senjutsu. Confirming the things that Tatsuya just said, they all started to panic. Tatsuya gave a sigh and then sat down and started waiting for them to calm down. Seeing his actions, his teammates gave a sigh and sat down as well. The Nakomata kept on panicking, and seeing that the Nekishu started to release their pressure on them, making them silent. The Nekishu then came forward and said, "We will stall him and his army for a while, and in the meantime you all run away." The Nakomata started to refute and asked them to not give away their lives for them. Tatsuya then stood up and said, "Can you really provide them enough time to run away? You're only giving their lives away for nothing, and if by any chance they all survive, then who is going to lead them in this world full of dangerous and selfish people like those devils coming here?" Hearing him, the Nekishu gritted their teeth, but didn't said anything. They all knew that what Tatsuya was saying was true, and they didn't have any way of saving themselves at all. Suddenly, Isumi came forward and grabbed Tatsuya's collar and said, "Then what do you think that we should do? Just hand ourselves to him and let him kill us." Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then sent her flying with a forehead flick, making the others look at them with a sweat drop. The others fell into despair, thinking that they don't have any way to save themselves. Suddenly, the rest of the Nekashu came forward and bowed their heads and said, "Then can you save them?" Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Yeah, I can save them." Hearing him, the Nakomata got a little hope, and they all looked at Tatsuya with expectant gaze. But Tatsuya, being like usual, was about to ask them for his compensation for saving them, but suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder. Tatsuya turned around and saw Himari looking at him with worried eyes and thought, "I guess I know what she is about to say." Tatsuya looked at her and asked, "What?" Himari said, "Tatsuya, can you please help them? Even if just for a bit. Asumi still helped me survive in the past." Tatsuya, who heard this, thought, "Bullseye inside." He then looked away and said, "Looks like there is still some work left for me. Remember, I will be taking more compensation once we get home for this favor as well." He said that and took off. After Tatsuya took off, the other Nikos looked at his team and asked, "Can he really defeat them all on his own?" His teammates looked at the Nikos and said, "Instead of worrying about him, you all should pity at the fate of those who are coming here. He can completely annihilate all the devils coming here without even trying." All of them looked at his team with shock, while they all simply smiled. Tatsuya continued to fly for a while, and soon he came across the Nekka pervert and his army. Tatsuya looked at Nabirius and said, "Yo, Nekka pervert, I am very surprised that you survived." Nabirius glared at him and said, I will fucking kill you. You not only took my lab rats away, but you destroyed my whole laboratory as well. All the years of my hard work suddenly destroyed. I will not let you live." Tatsuya yawned and said, "Done your ranting? Good, so shall we begin?" Hearing him, Nabirius gave a menacing smile and said, "Yes, we should begin. And to make sure to surely kill you, I brought the most powerful weapon that we have ever created. Thankfully, it was stored in my mansion storehouse. Bring it, boys." As he said that, the devils who were in the front shifted from their positions and revealed some devils, laborers, carrying a huge-ass machine. Tatsuya looked at the machine for a while and then said, "What does it do, Nekka pervert? Does it change anyone in the surrounding to a Nakomata who you can play with?" As Tatsuya said that, the devils who were carrying the machine suddenly lost strength in their arms, and the machine started to fall down. They all started to back away from Nabirius and looked at him with a disgusted look. Nabirius saw this and said, "You fools catch that right now. Why would I bring such a thing to kill someone?" As he said that, the devils rushed to the machine and somehow managed to catch it before it fell on the ground. Tatsuya then looked at Nabirius with a surprised expression and said, "Then do you mean that you really did made such a machine?" Everyone looked at Nabirius with expectant gaze, and seeing those looks, Nabirius became embarrassed and shouted, "Why would I tell you about that? Shut up and let me kill you." Suddenly, a devil who was standing beside Nabirius came towards him and whispered and asked, "Master, can we even make Lolas by that machine?" Nabirius looked at him and said, "Indeed, but that machine is still in development phase. Once it's done, I will make sure to let you all try that." Suddenly, the man's eyes shined brightly with enthusiasm. He looked at the rest of the devils and shouted, "Fellow devils, Master Nabirius have developed a machine by which we can make legal Lolas and has promised us to let us try that. Our days of salvation are not far now." The other devils who heard him became enthusiastic and shouted, "All hail Nabirius-sama, all hail Lolas." Seeing that, Tatsuya looked at all of them and thought, the whole Nabirius territory is Lullacon. That must be the reason that they didn't even touch those Nekashu I saved earlier. Tatsuya waited for them to calm down a bit and said, "You all done, pervs?" Nabirius looked at Tatsuya and said, "You sure are eager to die. Okay, men, let's kill him soon. The sooner we kill him, the faster I can start making that machine." All the devils looked at Tatsuya with a fire in their eyes and shouted, "Give your orders, Nabirius-sama." Nabirius started laughing and said, "Start the machine." A devil standing at the rear of the machine nodded and pressed a button. Tatsuya got ready for an attack to come towards him, but even after waiting for a while, the attack didn't come. Tatsuya looked at Nabirius confusedly and said, "Are you really sure that your machine is working?" Nabirius looked at Tatsuya and said, Of course it is, we just have to wait for it to charge up a bit. How do you expect a large attack if we don't have enough energy to support it? Tatsuya looked at him weirdly and thought, so this is the infamous charging time. I feel like it is similar to downloading a high-end game on a computer. Well, let's wait for a bit. I'm not in a hurry anyway. Tatsuya placed his hands on his shoulder and asked, so how much time will it take? Nibirius looked at him and said, about half an hour. Tatsuya nodded and said, well, when it is almost ready, tell me okay. Nibirius nodded and then started looking at the loading screen. Tatsuya took out a book and started reading it. When the half an hour was almost complete, Nibirius looked at Tatsuya and said, you should get ready, it's 95% charged. Tatsuya nodded and put the book back. Nibirius looked at the screen and started counting. 96, 97, 98, 99. Just as he said 99, Tatsuya took a rock and threw it at the machine with a bit of his strength and destroyed it. Tatsuya then looked at Nibirius's face and thought, that look of despair reminds me of myself whenever it happened to me while downloading a large file. He must be feeling completely torn from the inside now. Nibirius looked at Tatsuya and said, what have you done? You destroyed it when it was almost complete. How can you be so cruel? Tatsuya looked back at him and didn't say anything. He then showed him a mocking smile, making him getting enraged. Nibirius looked at the devils and shouted, kill him. Tatsuya didn't say anything and took out his Neo Serveresta and started to charge magic in it. The devils didn't care about him and started firing various magic attacks at him. Tatsuya continued to dodge the attack, and once the sword was completely charged, he said, now let's test the last one. He moved the hand holding the sword to his side and said, Void Splitter, and slashed the air in front of him. As soon as he executed the slash, a huge black wave of energy in the form of a slash rise towards the devils, destroying all the magic attacks in the process. Seeing the attack coming towards him, Nibirius tried to avoid the attack, but was not able to. To him, it looked like the attack was trying to pull it towards itself. Nibirius looked at the attack in horror, and soon the slash threw him and the other devils, cutting them all in the process. Some of them even tried to place a barrier in front of them, but the attack phased through them without any resistance. Tatsuya looked at the one-sided massacre in front of him and said, well, looks like my job is done. But today, I learned a new thing. He nodded his head and looked like he was thinking deeply. He then opened his eyes and said, looks like Azazel is not the only pervert who made something like a gender bender gun. He said that and started flying back. After defeating the Neko pervert and company, Tatsuya returned back to the village. All the Nekomata and Nekashu looked at him with an expectant gaze. Tatsuya looked at them for a while and then gave a thumbs up. When the others saw the thumbs up, they all cheered in happiness. Some of them even shed tears of joy and were celebrating among themselves. Tatsuya looked at the scene in front of him and thought, I know that they have the whole right to be happy because they are now safe from devil invasions. But why are they forgetting that now they don't have any place to stay or food to eat? So let's wait for a bit and then burst their bubble of happiness. And as per his thought, Tatsuya waited for them to celebrate a bit more and then said, you guys seem to be forgetting something? As he said that, all of them stopped celebrating and then got confused by his question. But soon as Sumi got what Tatsuya wanted to say and looked at the others and said, girls, do any of you know a place where we can stay now? At her question, the rest of the Nikos got shocked. Tatsuya could have sworn that he heard thunder in the background. All of them started to get impatient and started discussing what to do from now on, but were not able to reach any decision. Tatsuya looked at the situation for a while and then asked, do you want to live under the Yukai territory? At his question, all of them turned their heads and shouted, for real. Tatsuya was dumbfounded by their sudden change and remained still for a while. After gaining back his focus, he coughed and said, well, I can ask you Sokka about it first, and then only we could know. Tatsuya then began thinking about how to deal with the situation. Making the Yukai faction take in some refugees was not too much problem. The problem was that the refugees were originally from the underworld, so they might have suspicion on them of being spies. While Tatsuya was thinking, the other Nekashu other than Asumi came forward and asked, Tatsuya-san, no, Tatsuya-sama, can we come with you instead? As Tatsuya heard this, he felt that the atmosphere got a little colder, Miyuki, but he shrugged it off. He then looked at the Nekashu and asked, "And why do you all want to come with me instead of going to the Yukai faction, as being with your own kin would be much better for you? Don't you think so?" All of the Nekashu nodded their heads and said, "Yes, it is better for us to be present among our own kin, and the atmosphere around the Yukai territory would be very good for us as well." She then paused for a bit and said, "But we want to get strong," she said with a look of determination on her face, and the same was with the others present beside her. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then asked, "And why do you all want to become stronger?" Another Nekashu came forward and said, "We have already lost the people who lived with us in our respective villages because of our weaknesses. We would have been dead as well if not for you saving us. So please take us in. We are even ready to be your slaves. Just make us stronger so that we would not be in the same situation we were in before." When Tatsuya heard the word slave, a picture of him being in between naked Catwoman came in his mind. He thought that the idea would be good as their ears and tails looked soft and smooth, but he threw the idea of his mind and said, "But can't you become strong by being among the Yukai? There must be various techniques that they must have that would make you all stronger." All of them then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Even if they have some techniques, they would be still incompetent against the training style that you have. We know how strong that Himari girl is, and that too at such a young age, and all this was because of her training, or as she told us." As I said, that Tatsuya and his teammates all looked at Himari. Tatsuya with curiousness and Miyuki ending violed with anger. All these gazes made her uncomfortable, and she said, "What?" I said that on the heat of moment, I was very happy to meet my friend, and that's why I said that. They looked at her for a bit more, and finally sighing and shrugging it off. Tatsuya looked at the girls in front of him and said, "I will tell you my answer later. It is not a matter that I can think about in a spur of moment," he said, and turned around, making the Nekashu standing in front of him drop down their ears and tails in disappointment. But they soon came over it and thought that they were still not rejected. Tatsuya then went towards the other members of his team and said, "I'm going to talk about this matter to Yasaka. You all remain here and protect them, and also decide on the matter those Nekashu presented before me right now, as it will surely affect our team." Tatsuya then turned around and took some food supplies and made some makeshift houses. He then turned towards the Nekashu and said, "Stay here for the time being. I'm going to talk to Yasaka for a bit." He then made a portal and walked through it. Soon Tatsuya appeared in front of the headquarters of the Yukai faction in Kyoto. He looked at the guards who bowed their heads when they saw him, and Tatsuya did the same. Tatsuya was now recognized by most of the members of the Yukai faction and is respected by them. Tatsuya's strength and the times that he had helped them previously made his reputation grow among them. Tatsuya started walking towards the headquarters, and soon he found someone sneaking on him by his detection. Tatsuya smiled a bit and then disappeared from his spot. Seeing him disappear, the person following him came out and looked a bit displeased, but suddenly that person was strangled by someone and shouted, "Who are you? Let me go." The person who was strangling smiled and said, "Long time no see, Kanu." As Kanu heard the voice, she smiled and said, "Tatsuya and I." Tatsuya let her go and was immediately hugged by Kanu. Tatsuya smiled and hugged her back and said, "So you were trying to sneak up on me." As Kanu heard him, she got embarrassed and hid her face, Tatsuya's chest. Tatsuya chuckled and lifted her up and started walking with her in his arms. Kanu didn't said anything and simply enjoyed Tatsuya's embrace. They soon came in front of a huge Japanese-style mansion. Tatsuya came in front of a sliding door and was about to ask to enter, but was beaten down to it when Kanu jumped from his arms and entered the room without permission. Tatsuya looked at her and then bonked her head and said, "Bad manners, Kanu. You should not enter someone's room without permission." Kanu held her head and glared at Tatsuya with a pout and said, "Meanie." Tatsuya looked at her and thought, "So cute," and poked her cheeks. Tatsuya then heard a cough and turned his head. Standing before him was blonde and busta lady wearing a yellow kimono, which didn't help her a bit in hiding her huge chest. The most notable feature about her was 2 fox ears on her head and 9 golden yellow fluffy tails. Tatsuya smiled and said, "Yasaka, how have you been?" Yasaka smiled as well, and then walked towards him and hugged him and said, "I've been well, but now I'm better since you finally decided to visit me." Tatsuya laughed in embarrassment and said, "Sorry about not being able to meet you more often, but I've been way too busy for some time." Yasaka didn't said anything and continued to hug him. Seeing that she had no intention of letting him go for the time being, Tatsuya sighed and said, "Look, as much I want to continue what we're doing, I have some important business with you, so can we do that first?" Yasaka looked at him in the eye and said, "But can't we talk like this?" Tatsuya, who looked back at her, was mesmerized and was unable to hear what she said. Seeing his condition, Yasaka smiled and said, "Fu, looks like someone is enchanted by me." Suddenly, they were separated by Kunu, who hugged Tatsuya tightly and said, "Oka-san, leave Tatsuya alone." Yasaka chuckled and said, "But it looks like that he was enjoying it." Tatsuya suddenly got back to his senses and said, "What happened?" He looked around the room and saw a smiling Yasaka. Tatsuya then felt Kunu tightening her grip, so he looked at her and asked, "What happened?" Kunu looked at him with determination and said, "Just wait for me, Tatsuya. I will become more beautiful in future. So much beautiful that you will not even look at other girls." Tatsuya, who was still confused, was suddenly pulled and felt that his head hit something soft. Tatsuya looked up and saw Yasaka smiling at him. Yasaka got close to his face and said, "Then it looks like I have to make you obsessed with me before Kunu becomes that beautiful," and kissed him. Tatsuya was confused about what was happening around him and thought, "I don't know what all happened, but I literally don't care about any of that. Right now, I feel like I am in heaven," and enjoyed the kiss. Kunu, who was by their side, was covering her eyes, but still looked at them from between her finger and said, "Titi, that's as bad, Oka-san. That type of thing can only be done once you are married." Yasaka then looked at Kunu and said, Then it looks like we have to get married soon to this type of thing, right, Tatsuya?" Tatsuya unconsciously said, "Yeah," but soon he became focused and said, "Wait a bit, why the hell am I even doing all this? I still have some business dash." Kunu that came in front of him and said, "Tatsuya, you can pet my ears and my tails." Yasaka came forward as well and said, "Yeah, mine too." Tatsuya looked at the golden yellow tails swinging to and fro. To him it felt like that those tails were calling him. Tatsuya gulped his saliva and thought, "That business can wait for a while, I guess." After completing all the major tasks, Tatsuya was lying down with a happy face, and the same blissful expression was present on both Kunu's and Yasaka's face. Tatsuya was then brought back to his senses by a voice which said, "Looks like you are having the time of your life." Tatsuya became serious and said, "Not a word out of your mouth, and you can sleep in my room for a week. Deal, Kurumi?" Kurumi, who heard him, smiled and said, "Deal." Tatsuya then stood up and said, "Yasaka, this time I'm serious. We need to talk right now. This is very important." Yasaka, who heard his serious tone, became serious as well and said, "Okay, let's go to my office and discuss what you want to say." Tatsuya nodded, and both of them then went to her office. After an hour of discussion with Yasaka and other elders of the Yukai faction, they allowed the Nakomata to stay in the Yukai territory, but will constantly be monitored and would be checked by the others. Tatsuya talked with Yasaka and Kunu for a bit, and then returned back to the underworld. He then explained the matter that he discussed with Yasaka and the others and told them that they were allowed to stay there. He then went to his teammates and asked, "So what have you all decided?" They all looked at each other for a while and then said, "We don't have any problems with the four of them being in the team. We would have felt the same if we encountered such a situation of being so much helpless." Tatsuya nodded his head and then walked towards the Nekashu, who asked to be his slaves. Tatsuya looked at them and said, "Well, it looks like they all have agreed to you for being the part of our team." Hearing this, all of them beamed with happiness and said with a smile, "Thanks a lot, Tatsuya. We will try our best to work for you, and will train hard to not hinder you all." Tatsuya looked at them and then gave them a malicious smile and said, "Don't thank me so early. I will make sure to train you for so hard that you will start to think that death would be better than your life," and started laughing creepily. Seeing him laugh creepily, all four of them took a step back. Himari and the other placed their hands on their shoulders and said, "Don't worry. You will only want to die for the first 2 weeks or so." Hearing her, all four of them had the same thought No, 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 that's something that you should absolutely worry about. They are broken. They are completely broken. All four of them were covered in cold sweat when suddenly Tatsuya said, "Anyways, I am Tatsuya Shiba, and I hope that we all can get along from now on." A brown-haired Nekishu came forward when she heard him. Her hair was straight and long, long enough to reach her waist, and just like her hair, she had brown eyes. She bowed her head a bit and said, "Nice to meet you as well. My name is Shizuka. Please take care of me from now on." Following her example, a red-haired Nekishu bowed her head a bit. The girl had long red hair and red eyes. She looked at Tatsuya and said, "Nice to meet you. I am Karen. I look forward to working with you all." Then a black-haired Nekishu with long hair and hazel eyes came forward and said with a serious tone, "Kagura, I hope that I will learn a lot of things under you." And lastly, a light blue-haired girl with short hair came forward. She bowed a bit and said, "I'm Sanan, nice to meet you." After all of them introduced themselves, Tatsuya nodded and said, "We will go back to the headquarters first. I will explain to you about your jobs and all, and don't expect me to be lenient. I will make you work to the bone," Tatsuya said in a strict tone, and all four of them nodded their heads with determination. Tatsuya then looked at Asumi and said, "Make sure that all the people of your tribe are here. I'm going to take all of you back to the Yukai territory." After he said that, he turned around, but soon he remembered something and said, "And there is one thing that should be clear to you all. All of you are now dead while fighting the devils who were trying to kill you, and since the devils has issued the order of killing your kin, you don't have to worry about them chasing you all." After that, Asumi gathered all of her tribe, and all of them thanked Tatsuya for all the help that he had given. Tatsuya then accompanied them all back to the Yukai faction territory, and after some word spat between Yasaka, Kunu, and the rest of Tatsuya's teammates, except the ones that joined now, he teleported them to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Seeing the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, all the four Nekishu were beyond speechless, and now they had a new respect for Tatsuya. Tatsuya then asked others to show them around the place, and once they were done, Tatsuya gave them his basic training regime. After going through the regime, once the four of them were speechless, they all looked at the others and asked, "Do you all this much training daily?" Hearing the question, all of them shook their heads in denial, making them sigh in relief, only to become short on breath when they said, "The training we go through is at least 50 times more than the one written in that paper." Tatsuya then looked at them and said, "Once again, welcome to the team, and I hope that you all don't die before you are able to reach your desired level of strength." After all the four Nekishu finally settled in Shiba residence, Tatsuya started his tour, cough asterisk training, and just like his other teammates, victims, they too began thinking that dying was better, just like Tatsuya promised. As the time passed on, Tatsuya continued to train the others as well, and the one who progressed the most among them was Ingvild. She took a jump and broke through the mid-ultimate class along with Miyuki and Himari. Though they were happy for her friend's progress, they still felt a bit hurt because of her progress speed. The new Nekishus were not far behind as well. According to Tatsuya, those four had great potential, and due to their experience in the real world, they do know fairly well how to work hard. All four of them were able to use Senjutsu, Chakra, Ki, and Magic as well, which was not even the case with the Miyuki, Himari, and Ingvild. Though they didn't have great talents like the others, they were still able to hold themselves up against them. Tatsuya has trained them in all the forms of energy without neglecting their physical training as well. All four of them were able to perform close-quarter combat and fly using Ki. They were also able to use their respective weapons, except Shizuka, who only likes to use her bare fists. Kagura was a katana user, and Tatsuya has given her Sasuke's Kusanagi sword, which is also modified to use wind and lighting elements as well. Karen was a dagger user and uses two similar daggers. Tatsuya has given her two Hestia blades and modifying them to suit her hands by increasing the length of the blades. The blade were also able to grow along with the user, just like its properties, and its length can be changed as well. The dagger has various status defect abilities like poisoning, paralysis, etc., which can be activated by inflicting a strike at the enemy. Sanan was a long-range fighter, and Tatsuya has given her a shape-shifting weapon, which is able to change in various forms of guns and some other weapons, though it requires her own magic for transformation. though she can even fire ki orbs whose destructive power is much more than her weapons. Fighting with her weapon is much more efficient for her. Tatsuya also made each of them spar against each other from time to time. He sometimes even take all of them head-on. Tatsuya has also given the same type of rings and necklaces to them, like the ones he gave to Miyuki. Tatsuya also started to make the study inerter to make them enroll in the high school when the time comes. Though Shizuka was exempted from this as she looked older and seemed to be in her 20s, but she still had to learn about the common knowledge about their society. Tatsuya has started to look more mature and handsome than before, and the same thing was felt by his teammates. Seeing Tatsuya's chiseled body and his handsome face, nearly all the ladies on the streets try to get in his pants. In this time period, the other members of his team has grown as well. Their bodies are now more developed, and their beauty was now on another level. There are now instances when even Tatsuya get mesmerized by them easily, much to their pleasure. The new Nekishu have also started to fight with the other girls for Tatsuya's affection, making the previous competitors feel annoyed. They have also met all the other people from Vala Team, Devils, and even Azazel, who after seeing Tatsuya's condition, started teaching him ways to control the situation around him, and Tatsuya had to agree that those tips were great in solving most of the problems around him, and even prevented lots of bloodbaths. Tatsuya has also earned himself a reputation in the neighborhood for threatening the people, perverts, who seem to have the guts to flirt or act pervertedly with his teammates. He has even kicked Issei and his friends as many times for trying to be pervy around his girls. Tatsuya has also become busier than ever before, doing the paperwork and meetings for the company, managing the food chains, writing, and publishing books. His schedule has become so hectic that he started to use his shadow clones and mind control to do his jobs. Like this, 2 years pass by, and right now, in the Shiba household, Tatsuya is standing while holding a paper and is fuming with rage. Even his hands are vibrating while he is clutching the paper. Tatsuya looked at the paper, which looked like some sort of letter, and thought, why is all this happening with me? Someone is seriously fucking with my life, and the worst part of all is that there is no way of not being involved in this shit. Just what is that the one who is shitting me want? Tatsuya then glared at the paper once again and sighed. The letter that Tatsuya was holding was about a trip that his company has gifted him to Vatican. It is one of the companies where he works, and he is still not bought yet. Then calmed down and thought, well, nothing can be done about it, and it is not like I will get involved with her as soon as I go there, right? After it was decided that Tatsuya would be going to Vatican, he asked the others whether they wanted to GI with him, but all of them declined his offer and said that they had something to do. Tatsuya was a bit surprised at that and decided to check what they were planning to do by his telepathy, and after listening to their thoughts, he came to know that they all were going to have a girls' day out along with the Devils. Tatsuya also decided to check the situation beforehand by necklace that he had given to Irina at the time of her departure. Though he hasn't ever used this, and it was only made to activate when her life is in danger. But this time was emergency, so he used his forced telepathy and connected to Irina's mind and came to know that neither her nor Zenobia would be there. Now the only problem that he could face was getting involved with some angels. Tatsuya didn't give it any further thought and decided to just enjoy by himself while he was there. The next day, Tatsuya got ready for his trip to Vatican, and after promising the others that he would get them a souvenir, he took his flight for Vatican. After reaching Vatican, the first thing that Tatsuya decided to do was to go to his hotel, and after checking in the hotel, he left his luggage in his room and decided to look around the place. He walked around the city for a while, but then suddenly he detected holy aura in the area. Feeling the aura, Tatsuya twitched his lips, but still decided to look into it. Though it was troublesome, he was still curious about the fluctuations. He increased his pace and started running in the direction of the holy aura. While he was running, Tatsuya felt that he stepped on something, but didn't give it much thought and continued running. After running for a while, he didn't find anything unusual and decided to check again with his detection and found the same holy aura coming from the way where he came from and started running again. And once again, while running, something came under his feet and he ignored it once again. And still running for a while, he didn't find anything unusual. Getting annoyed by all that hassle, he still didn't give up and again checked for the aura and found it through his detection from the earlier position. Noticing the direction from where the aura was coming for Tatsuya's eyebrows twitched, and this time he decided to directly teleport there instead of running. He locked the position of the aura and then teleported after confirming that no one was around. As soon as he teleported, he again felt like he stepped on something, but this time he didn't ignore it and looked down. Once Tatsuya looked down, he saw a blonde-haired lady lying down on the ground with her back facing the sky. Tatsuya looked at her for a while and then asked while still standing on her, Are you all right?" The lady lifted her head a bit with difficulty and said, "I would feel much better if you kindly stepped down from me." Tatsuya, who now noticed that he was standing on her, quickly got off her and bowed his head and said, "I am really sorry about that. I didn't do that on purpose." The lady, who was still lying on the floor, shook her head and said, "It's okay. I forgive you. At least you have got the courtesy of apologizing to me. Before, you two people stepped on me and didn't even notice me. They were very rude. I hope that God don't give any protection upon them." Tatsuya, who heard her, averted his eyes and said, "Why, yeah, those people must be idiots to not notice a beautiful lady lying on the floor." Tatsuya then offered her a hand and said, "Here, get up." The lady took his hand and stood up and then looked at him and said with a smile, "Thank you." Tatsuya, who now had the chance to look at her face, was mesmerized by her beauty. He then snapped out of it when he noticed the lady waving her hand in front of him. Seeing Tatsuya get out of his own world, the lady smiled and said, "I'm Gabriel. Nice to meet you." When Tatsuya heard her name, he got surprised, but he didn't show it on his face. He then did a curt bow and said, "Nice to meet you as well. My name is Tatsuya." Tatsuya then looked up and was about to ask her something, but suddenly he heard a growl from Gabriel's stomach. Tatsuya now looked back at Gabriel and found her completely red with embarrassment. He then chuckled a bit and said, "Miss Gabriel, will you have lunch with me?" Gabriel, being an angel, was about to reject him, but then her stomach growled again, making her decision waver. Seeing her in dilemma, Tatsuya smiled at her and said, It's my way of asking you for forgiveness for stepping on you, and also having lunch with a beautiful lady such as yourself would be a great honor for me." Hearing him, Gabriel smiled at him and said, "I usually don't take such offers, but since you are being so insistent, I will gladly accompany you." And as she said that, her stomach growled again, making Tatsuya laugh and Gabriel embarrassed. Tatsuya then took her to a nearby restaurant, which was popular among the people living there. They placed their orders there, and by seeing the amount of food that Gabriel ordered, both Tatsuya and the waiter was completely shocked. Tatsuya then decided to make some small talk with the angel. And after talking for a while, she opened up easily to him, making Tatsuya feel how innocent she was. Tatsuya came to know that Gabriel is likely to came from the heaven entered her to do some business in church, and after doing this, she wandered on her own to look around the city, and after walking around the city for a while, Gabriel got hungry, and since she was not carrying her wallet, she started finding an abandoned place in order to go back to heaven. But before she could find the place, she started starving and passed out on the middle of the street because of lack of food. Hearing her story, Tatsuya looked at her weirdly and thought, how could a seraph pass out because of hunger? Tatsuya pondered about it for a while, but then shrugged it off when the waiter brought their food. While eating, Tatsuya and Gabriel continued to talk to each other, and when Gabriel came to know that he came from Japan, he got a bit excited. She told Tatsuya that she liked Japanese food and entertainment industry and was a huge fan of his manga, and when Tatsuya told her that he was the one who created the manga, she got way too much excited. She asked him for his autograph and also decided to tour around the city along with him while he was here. After finishing their meal, Tatsuya paid the bill, and then both of them bid farewell to each other. Tatsuya then silently placed a rune on her, and after a while, when she teleported back to heaven, he marked the spot entered her to teleport to heaven whenever he needed to. He then started walking back to his hotel and thought, now that I think about it, most of the mess that I've gotten myself into was mostly because of blondes, Yasaka, Keisha, Riser Asumi, Gabriel. All of them are blondes who got me into troublesome situations. He then started chuckling and thought jokingly, I would not be surprised if I got in trouble again because of someone blonde. As he thought that, he suddenly crashed into someone. Though Tatsuya didn't fell down the same, was not for the one who crashed into him. Tatsuya then looked towards the person who crashed into him and saw a girl on the ground with her flipped skirt, which clearly showed the white panties she was wearing. But Tatsuya didn't give attention to any of that and had only one word left his mouth: blonde. Tatsuya blanked out for a while, and once he came back to his reasoning, the first thing he did was look up towards the sky, raised both his hands, and said, "Whoever is fucking with my life, I just have a few words to say to you." Tatsuya then took a deep breath, pointed both his middle fingers toward the sky, and shouted, "Just fuck yourself." Tatsuya, who was breathing heavily because of anger, soon calmed himself down, and he then heard the blonde's voice who said, "Ow, it hurts." Tatsuya then looked at the fallen blonde and moved his hands towards her and said, "I am sorry about that. Are you all right?" The blonde, who looked towards Tatsuya and nodded her head shyly. She took his hand and stood up and said, "It's all right. I was also not looking forward while walking, so it should be me who should apologize," and bowed her head. Tatsuya waved his hands and said, "No, no, no. I am sorry for crashing into you. That must have hurt you." The blonde, who saw Tatsuya apologizing her, started to apologize again, and just like that, both of them continued to apologize to each other for a while. Tatsuya, who was starting to get annoyed by all that, pointed his finger at the blonde and said, "Why can't you just accept my apology? I already said that it was my fault." The blonde, who heard Tatsuya's frustrated tone, got a bit scared and again bowed her head and said, "I am really sorry." Tatsuya finally snapped. He moved his hand towards her and flicked her forehead, making her take a step back. He then looked at the blonde, who was holding her forehead and had watery eyes. Tatsuya then said, "Apologize again, and I will flick you harder." Hearing him, she was about to apologize again, but when he saw Tatsuya preparing to flick her again, she immediately covered her mouth with her hands. Seeing her actions, Tatsuya backed his hand away and said, "Sorry about the forehead flick. I was really desperate that time." The blonde again bowed her head and said, "I am really sorry for annoying you," but soon realized that she apologized unconsciously again and noticed Tatsuya moving her hand forward. She then prepared herself for another forehead flick and strongly shut her eyes. Tatsuya, who looked at her side and unconsciously patted her head and said, "Leave it. If this continues, you would end up apologizing the whole day." The blonde, who received the head pat, opened her eyes in astonishment and looked at Tatsuya. Tatsuya noticed her gaze and said, "What? I'm not going to apologize again. I don't want to keep standing here the whole day." The blonde, who heard him, snapped out of her thoughts and said, "Sword dash." She was again about to apologize, but Tatsuya moved his other hand forward in flicking position, making her stop. Tatsuya nodded her head and said, "Good. Now let's introduce ourselves. I am Tatsuya. It's nice meeting you, apology girl." The blonde, who heard him, became embarrassed and said, "Nice to meet you as well. I am Asia Argento." Tatsuya moved his hand back and said, "Well, it's good that we finally stopped, but I want to ask you something." He then pointed toward the ground and said, "Aren't they yours?" Asia followed the direction he was pointing to and saw various food items spilled here and there. She looked at it for a while and then exclaimed, "My groceries." Tatsuya, who heard her, got surprised. He had never thought that the most innocent and shy girl in the whole series could have shouted like that, but he didn't give it much thought and said, "Looks like they were yours, so what are you going to do about that now?" Asia, who heard him, looked at him with tears in her eyes. Seeing her crying, Tatsuya could somehow felt very painful from inside. He then shook his head and looked at all the things that were falling on the ground. He then held her hand and said, "Tell me where is the nearest supermarket," and started pulling her. Both of them reached the supermarket, and Tatsuya immediately bought all the things that were falling on the ground and gave it to her. Though she kept on refusing him, Tatsuya made her agree, finally saying that it was his way of asking forgiveness, which he literally did for a while, for crashing into her. Tatsuya then decided to take her back to the church, as it was already very late, and there was a chance for her to get into some sort of trouble because of her clumsiness. While they both were on their way towards the church, they kept talking to each other, which made Asia very delighted. She had never experienced this type of joy because when she was in the church, most of the people either kept a distance from her or don't talk to her formally because of her status as saint. Because of that, she had no friends, and that made her interaction that she had with Tatsuya was very enjoyable. After reaching the church, Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Well, this is it, I guess. So farewell, Asia." and turned around to leave. Asia, who saw him going back, was very sad and unconsciously held his sleeve, making him turn around and look at her. Tatsuya looked at Asia and asked, "What happened?" Asia, who heard him, came out of her trance and became red with embarrassment. Finally mustering up some courage, she looked towards Tatsuya, still blushing, and said, "WW, will we meet again?" Tatsuya, who saw her expression, had only one thought, "See," and had stopped functioning. Asia, who saw him not responding to him, waved her hand in front of her eyes, but there was still no response. Seeing that, she got worried and started shaking him while saying, "Tatsuya-san, come back," making him finally came back to reality. Tatsuya blinked his eyes for a while and then said, "Sorry, what were you saying?" Asia looked at him and said with a pout, "Don't just snap out of reality like that, you make me worried." Seeing her pout, Tatsuya chucked and said, "Sorry about that, but I was mesmerized by your cuteness." We said that Asia blushed and looked away and said, "Don't tease me, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya chuckled and said, "Fine, fine. So what were you asking me?" Asia looked back at him and asked, "Will we meet again?" Tatsuya looked at her and smiled and said, "I don't know about that as I live far away, but I am staying here for about a week, so like we can hang out together while I am here." Tatsuya then patted her head and said, "You should go back inside now. It's starting to get cold, and we can meet tomorrow as well if you want." Hearing him, Asia's face beamed with joy, and she vigorously nodded her head and said, "Of course, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya smiled and said, "Then I will come here and pick you up, and you can show me around the city." Asia nodded and then went inside the church. As soon as she went inside the church, Tatsuya's face became serious, and he thought, "So that Diodora guy has already laid her eyes on Asia, huh? Then it means that the fallen angels will be coming here soon as well." He then gave a tired sigh and said, "Well, I'm not going to let Asia go with fallen angels, that's for sure," and then started walking back toward his hotel. After that day, Tatsuya went around the city with both Asia and Gabriel, earning him jealous looks from both males and females around the city. Gabriel was also happy with Asia joining as well, since she was innocent and a believer of God, a Bible as well. And she was also glad because Asia knew about the area well and was guide for both her and Tatsuya. Same was the case with Asia, as she was able to interact with both Tatsuya and Gabriel as friends and was enjoying her time to the fullest. Though she was still unknown about Gabriel's identity as a seraph, but Tatsuya could bet that if she knew she was a seraph, her whole trip would be ruined, and to make sure that they were not disturbed by anyone, he silently cast an undetectable barrier around which hid their presences, so that other people from heaven or church could not trouble them. And right now, Tatsuya and others were sitting in a cafe, having a meal. Today is the last day that they all would be meeting, as Tatsuya would be returning back to Japan the next day. Tatsuya also kept tabs on Diodora, who seemed to have called some of the devils here from Underworld and was currently in the chase from church officials. He did not know what he was planning, but he was sure that he was about to initiate his plan on making Asia get excommunicated from the church. Tatsuya decided to not act quickly and wait for him to make the first move. After all, he did not want to deal with him even before he did anything wrong. Because if he did that, the whole devil faction would cause trouble for him, as Diodora is still the heir of one of the families of 72 pillars and is also the brother of the Mao, Ajuka. Dealing with him now will only lead him to more and more troubles, however you look at it. Tatsuya then looked at the girls sitting next to him and talking to each other while eating their food happily. Tatsuya looked at their interaction and smiled. Suddenly, he felt another great holy energy coming towards him, and it seemed like Gabriel noticed it as well. Tatsuya immediately dispelled the barrier so as to not cause any suspicion, and just as he did that, the door of the cafe opened. Tatsuya, Asia, and Gabriel all looked in the donor's direction and saw a handsome young man with blonde hair wearing a white suite standing there. The blonde-haired man started looking around, and when he looked in Tatsuya's direction, he smiled. Tatsuya, who saw his smile, looked at Gabriel, who was hiding her face behind a menu card. Tatsuya then again looked back at the blonde man and then saw him coming towards them. Soon the blonde man came near their table and said, "Good day to all of you." Tatsuya and Asia simply nodded, and Tatsuya looked at Gabriel and asked, "Someone you know, Gabriel?" When Gabriel heard him, she slowly showed her face and said, Yes, meet him, Tatsuya. Asia. His name is Michael, my brother. Tatsuya, who heard her, nodded, and then stood up, and then moved his hand forward, offering him to shake hands, and said, "Nice to meet you, Michael-san. I am Tatsuya." Michael smiled at him, and then shook his hand and said, "Nice to meet you as well. Like my sister, just say my name is Michael. I thank you for taking care of my sister." Tatsuya smiled as well, and said, No, the pleasure is all mine. She is a very good person to have to talk and tour around the city." When Michael heard him, he became surprised, and then looked at Gabriel and asked, "Ho, talking and touring around the city? Now that's some news to me. Gabriel, want to explain yourself?" Gabriel, who heard him, started to sweat, and looked at Tatsuya with an expression which said, "Why did you say that?" Tatsuya looked at her, and then slowly averted his eyes. He has already grasped the situation she was in, and was not planning to join her side to help her. It was her own fault for coming here without telling Michael the reason and neglecting her work as a seraph. Seeing that Tatsuya had already given up on her, she looked at Asia with a pleading expression. Asia, who saw her, nodded, and then looked at Michael with an innocent smile and said, "Yes, Gabriel-san was very fun to talk to. She also kept me company during the whole week while we toured around the city." When she finished speaking, Gabriel slammed her head on the table, and, seeing them, Tatsuya was trying very hard to not laugh at her situation. Michael's eyebrows were twitching when he heard what Asia said. He looked at Gabriel and said, "So you were enjoying while neglecting and pushing all your work on me, huh? Now I understand why the pile of files which I was getting was bigger than usual during this week. Looks like I have to give you an appropriate punishment for ditching your work on me once we go back." When Gabriel heard him, tears started to form at the corner of her eyes, but suddenly an idea came to her mind, and she pointed her finger at Tatsuya and said, "It's not my fault, Michael. During the whole week, I was meeting with Tatsuya-san, the one who is the creator of the manga that we usually read. You like his work as well, right?" When Michael heard her sister, his eyes widened, and he looked towards Tatsuya and grabbed his hand and asked, "Are you really Saitama-sensei?" Tatsuya, who was dumbfounded by him, unconsciously nodded her head, and suddenly Michael started to shake his hands violently and said, "I am a big fan, sensei. I have read all your books 3 times each. It was really a masterpiece." Tatsuya started to get more and more shocked on seeing Michael's reaction. He could not believe that the current ruler of heaven was sitting in front of him. The calm and collected image of Michael that he had from his own world started crumbling. After that, Michael forgot about Gabriel and started to ask questions to Tatsuya, making him more and more freaked out. Tatsuya looked at Gabriel, who looked back at him with an innocent smile. Seeing her smile, Tatsuya's lips twitched, and he thought, "I will deal with her later." Even Asia was giving him a helpless look on seeing his condition. After talking for a while, all of them left the cafe, and Michael and Gabriel started to leave. Michael turned towards both Asia and Tatsuya and said, "It was nice meeting both of you, and thank you for taking care of me and my sister today." Tatsuya smiled and said, "It was my pleasure that you spent some of your time with us. It was enjoyable for me as well." He then looked at Gabriel, who was talking with Asia, who seemed a bit sad because of today being the last day that she will be seeing her. Tatsuya then smiled and said, "When the next time we meet, make sure to complete your work beforehand and not ditch it on your brother." When they heard him, all of them had different reactions. Michael narrowed his eyes and looked at Gabriel and said, "Yes, I will make sure that it not happens again." Gabriel began sweating again and was panicking after hearing her brother. Asia was chuckling on seeing Gabriel, making her feel betrayed. Gabriel then walked towards Tatsuya and said, "You don't have to remind him." Tatsuya just smiled at her, and seeing that she sighed and smiled as well. Tatsuya then looked at her and said, "It was nice meeting you here in Vatican. Though our meeting was not normal, I still enjoyed touring with you a lot." Gabriel, who heard him, suddenly hugged him, making all 3 of them surprised. She then said, "I enjoyed it as well. It was the first time that I was able to have so much fun, and it was because of you I was able to make friends as well." She then began to tear up a bit and said, "Will you come back to see me again? I want to meet you and Asia again and enjoy around just like we did during this week." Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled as well and hugged her back and said, "I don't know if I'll come back here or not, but I promise you that we will meet again, and at that time we will again have fun just like we did. And if you ever feel too lonely, you can always come to Kuo. I will be there always, or you can just call me whenever you want to talk. Gabriel stopped crying and nodded her head while still hugging him. She then stopped hugging him and then stood in front of him smiling. Tatsuya smiled as well and then moved his hand forward. In his hand was a small box covered in gift wrap. Gabriel looked at the box curiously, and Tatsuya said, "Here a gift for you." When she heard that, she became happy and immediately took it from him and started opening it. Seeing her like that, all three of them started chuckling at her childishness. Once Gabriel opened the box, it contained a beautiful necklace with a pendant having two angelic wings and a yellow gemstone similar to her hair. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "Thank a lot, Tatsuya. It's very beautiful." Tatsuya smiled and nodded her head, but then Gabriel took the necklace in her hand, then moved her hand in front of Tatsuya, making him confused. She smiled and said, "Tie it around my neck." Tatsuya took the necklace and tied it. Gabriel then turned around and showed the others, "How does it look on me?" All of them smiled and complimented her. Gabriel then placed her hand on her chin, making a thinking pose, and said, "Now what should I give you to make you remember me?" Tatsuya, who heard him, waved his hand and said, "There is no need for something like that." But Gabriel ignored him and continued thinking. After thinking for a while, her face brightened up and she hit her palm with her fist and said, "I know, there was a movie I once saw, yeah, that is perfect," and started moving towards Tatsuya. Tatsuya, who saw her coming towards him, decided to use his telepathy to hear what she was thinking, but before he was able to, Tatsuya was kissed by Gabriel. Seeing what she just did, all the people standing there had their eyes widened, and some of the passers-by were smiling on seeing them. Gabriel then moved back, leaving behind a stupefied Tatsuya and a blushing Asia. Gabriel, who saw both of them, became confused and looked at Michael and asked, "What happened, Michael? Why are they like that?" Michael, who heard her, grabbed her shoulders and started shaking her and asked, "Why did you just kiss him? Do you know what could have happened?" Gabriel became even more confused and said, "What is wrong with that? I saw in a movie that the girl kissed the boy on the lips when she saw her friend leaving her for a long time." Hearing her, all three of them thought, "So innocent." Michael sighed and thought, "Good thing that she didn't have any lust in that kiss. Otherwise, she would have fallen before she knew it." He then saw his sister, who was looking confused when Tatsuya was scolding her. Michael smiled and thought, "Still, it looks like my sister finally found someone she likes. It looks like I have to increase the pace of working on that dimensional chamber, or else the day when she falls is not far away." After Tatsuya was done scolding Gabriel, thought it still didn't have any effect on her, Michael and Gabriel left, leaving Tatsuya alone with Asia. Both of them stood there for a while, and Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Well, should we get going as well?" Asia, who heard him, nodded her head in silence. Seeing her like that, Tatsuya came closer to her and flicked her forehead lightly, making her hold her forehead in a bit of pain. She then looked at Tatsuya, who was looking at her with a neutral expression. Tatsuya then took a step forward and said, "You should not be sad that Gabriel will not be able to meet with you for a while. Instead, you should think about what all you will do once you meet her again soon. She is still your friend and will remain one, unless both of you have some dispute." Tatsuya then smiled and patted her head. Asia, who was sad just a moment before, wiped her eyes and smiled and said, "Yes, I will wait to meet her again." Tatsuya then moved his hand back, and then both of them started going back to the church. After reaching back to the church, Tatsuya looked at Asia and said, "Looks like we part our ways here." He then smiled and said, "I will come in the morning to visit you before going back." Asia, who now remembered that Tatsuya would also be going back to Japan, was sad once again, but didn't get depressed like earlier. She then smiled and said, "Omu, see you tomorrow then, and surely promise me to come here tomorrow." Tatsuya, who saw her smile, smiled as well and said, Yeah, I promise you that I will surely come," and turned around and started walking away. Soon Tatsuya came back to his room in the hotel and decided to take a bath to get refreshed. And after taking his bath, he lied on the bed and entered her to sleep. A few hours later, Tatsuya suddenly got up and was still a little sleepy. He hurriedly went to the bathroom and splashed water on his face so as to reduce his sleepiness. Tatsuya then wiped his face and thought, "Those devils are starting to act a bit suspicious. Well, let's confront them before they are able to lay a hand on Asia." He then changed his clothes and then put a mask on his face, entered her to hide his identity. He then hid his presence altogether and turned invisible and started to fly towards the devils. Soon he came across some devils fighting against some church exorcists. Tatsuya saw the battle between the two parties, and it was clear that the devils were on the winning side. Tatsuya then noticed a young man fighting on the devil's side. The young devil had dark green hair and golden eyes, and from his appearance Tatsuya concluded that he was the one who is called Diodora Astaroth. Tatsuya observed them for a while and was waiting for him to make a move towards Asia, but even after waiting for an hour, Diodora didn't do anything other than fighting. After a while, when all the exorcists were killed, all the devils gave a sigh and then sat down on the ground. One of them looked toward Diodora and said, "Boss, do you really think that it is really worth it for just one single nun?" When Tatsuya heard this, his ears perked up, and he started listening to them intently. Diodora looked towards the devil and said, "Of course it is worth for that nun. She has a healing-type sacred gear as well, and just because of that she is very famous among the masses. Now just think about it. The look which she would have once she is betrayed by the ones who revered her as a saint. I can't wait to see that look for myself. And once she has gone through all that, I who was responsible for all the suffering she went through by healing me, would take her in my peerage, and she will not even hesitate, because she doesn't have anyone to rely on." Tatsuya was getting angrier and angrier on hearing his plan. He just wanted to kill him on the spot, but didn't do so because technically he was still innocent and hasn't harmed her yet. Another devil then looked towards Diodora and said, "Then why did you send one of the devils disguised as yourself to her location instead of going yourself?" Tatsuya, who heard this, became shocked, and then used his clairvoyance to check Asia's location, and indeed saw an injured devil lying in front of the church. He then didn't wait for them to talk anymore, and immediately used his telepathy to hear their thoughts. After hearing all their thoughts, Tatsuya gritted his teeth in rage, and then made a huge energy blast and fired it towards the devils. He didn't even wait to see the results after the explosion, and immediately teleported in an empty location near the church, and started running towards Asia's location. What Tatsuya learned from hearing their thoughts was that instead of actually going near Asia, Diodora disguised a hypnotized devil like him, and then sent him there after injuring him, and decided to make a similar scar on himself after he was healed, and then dispose that devil. He did this because there was a chance of an exorcist killing him in an injured state even before Asia can heal him. Tatsuya soon reached her and saw her still healing the devil. Tatsuya frowned and immediately ran towards her, grabbed her hand, and separated her from the devil. Asia, who saw someone stopping her from healing the devil, was surprised and started to struggle inward her to free herself. Tatsuya, who saw her struggle, held her more tightly and said, "Asia, stop. This is me, Tatsuya." When Asia heard his voice, she got surprised and stopped struggling. She then looked at Tatsuya and said, "What are you doing here, Tatsuya-san?" Tatsuya then let her go as she had calmed down and said, "I cannot tell you right now. We'll talk about this later." He then looked at the position where Asia was healing the devil and saw that the devil had already gone. Tatsuya was angry on seeing that and now knew what was going to happen there soon. And just like his expectations, some of the nuns and priests gathered around him and Asia and started calling her witch and heretic because she healed the devil. Tatsuya, who saw how soon they started accusing someone who they were calling saint not too long ago, was very angry with them. He would have even destroyed the church in front of him if Asia was not with her right now. Asia, who was now seeing the others accusing her for healing a devil and calling her witch and heretic, was crying on seeing the people that she trusted treating her like that. She then saw some of the people among the crowd throw rocks at her. She shut her eyes and was shaking on fear and expecting to get hurt. She continued to wait for the rock to hit her, but she didn't feel any pain at all. She then opened her eyes and saw someone standing in front of her and shielding her from the rocks. She looked at the person's back and unconsciously muttered, "Tatsuya." Tatsuya, who heard her, turned around and lifted his mask a bit, which revealed a small yet comforting smile to her. He then put his mask back and then used a magic on the people gathered around them and made them all unconscious. After checking, all of them were unconscious. Tatsuya looked at Asia and removed his mask and said, I know that you have many questions and that you must be feeling very bad, but let's get out of here first. Asia, who was still shivering with fear, nodded her head and tried to stand up, but was unable to, seeing that Tatsuya crouched down and then lifted her in a princess carry and started flying away after turning himself and Asia invisible. Asia hugged him tightly and was still crying because of what happened to her just now, and seeing that Tatsuya started to console her. Tatsuya was fuming with rage and was blaming himself for not checking on her before instead of waiting for Diodora. He was then brought out of his inner turmoil when he heard Asia's hand on his cheek. Asia, who had been crying for a while, looked at Tatsuya and felt that he was very sad and angry and placed her hand on his cheeks in order to gain his attention. Tatsuya looked at her and then increased his speed, and soon he reached an empty park. He then landed there, and both of them then sat on the bench. Asia then looked at Tatsuya, who looked at her as well, and both of them asked at the same time, Are you all right? Tatsuya then nodded his head and said, Forget about me. Tell me, are you all right? You are not hurt anywhere, are you? Asia shook her head and said, No, I am not hurt thanks to you. Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled, but soon his smile disappeared, and he bowed his head in front of her, making her surprised, and said, I am sorry, Asia. Asia, who heard him, waved her hands and said, You don't have to apologize, Tatsuya-san. It was not you who did all that to me. Tatsuya then shook his head and said, No, if I had come earlier, then I could have saved you from all this from happening. If only I noticed it sooner. Asia was now confused after Tatsuya said all that. Tatsuya, who saw her confused expression, started to tell her what he was talking about except for his previous life knowledge part. Asia, who now understood what all happened, hugged Tatsuya and said, It was not your fault, Tatsuya-san. You tried to save me even though you didn't know about their plan from the beginning. Don't blame yourself for something that you have not done, and started crying. Tatsuya hugged her back and started to pat her back so as to console her. Soon he heard a snore and then looked at Asia, who was sleeping in his embrace. Tatsuya tried to remove her from his embrace in order to lie her down, but Asia was hugging him tightly and was not letting him go. Tatsuya sighed and then continued to hold her. He then used his clairvoyance to check on the devil's conditions and saw that all the devils except Diodora and the one which Asia healed were dead. But Diodora still received many injuries and have lost his left hand permanently. Diodora was wincing in pain and soon left by teleporting away by his magic circle after killing the devil whom he hypnotized before. Tatsuya gritted his teeth in anger on not being able to kill him because Asia was with her, but soon sighed in annoyance and decided to deal with him later, and then fell asleep. The next morning, Asia woke up when the sun's rays fell on her eyes. She then rubbed her eyes and tried to stand up, but was unable to. She then looked at her surroundings and saw that it was not her room in the church, and soon all the memories about yesterday flashed in front of her eyes, making her feel sad. Her gaze then finally fell on Tatsuya, in whose embrace she was sleeping earlier. On seeing Tatsuya's sleeping face, she blushed, but then soon she began to smile, and then again hugged him back and said, Thank you. Tatsuya suddenly woke up and said, What happened? Who is there? Making Asia surprised. Tatsuya then looked at his surroundings and saw a panicking and blushing Asia, making her understand what happened. He looked at her and said, Good morning, to which Asia replied as well. He then stopped hugging her and then stood up and stretched his body. He then looked at Asia and asked, What will you be doing from now on? Hearing him, Asia put her head down and said, I will go back to the church to see if they are still willing to accept me or not. Tatsuya, who saw her sad expression, put his hands on her shoulder and said, I will go with you as well, to which she showed a grateful smile. Both of them then went to the church, and just like in the anime, she was banished from the church because of healing a devil. Both of them then left the church in silence. Tatsuya didn't said anything to her and let her clear her mind. Soon she stopped walking and looked down. Tatsuya, who saw her, moved towards her and hugged her and said, You can cry all you want. I won't leave you till you are fine, so just let it all out. Asia, who heard him, started crying loudly while hugging Tatsuya. Tatsuya just stood there and kissed her back. After a while, Asia stopped crying and looked at Asia with red and puffy eyes. Tatsuya took out a wet towel and wiped her face, making her feel embarrassed. Asia then bowed her head and said, "Thank you, Tatsuya-san." Tatsuya shook his head and said, "It's all right, but what are you planning to do with your life now?" Asia, who heard him, got depressed and said, "I don't know, Tatsuya-san. I have never thought of a life that I would live outside the church." Tatsuya patted her head and said, "Then, do you want to join my team?" Asia looked up and asked, "What team?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "You see, I have a team of sorts because faring in the supernatural world alone is very difficult and lonely. We too have similar conditions like yours, and we live together and depend on each other. You can also make a lot of friends there as well." Asia, when heard that she could make friends, was happy, but then her smile faded and she asked, "But won't I be a bother? After all, I'm not strong." Tatsuya, who heard her, smiled and said, "Who said you would be a bother? And if you were, do you think I would have asked you? You have your healing powers, which are greatly needed in our group, who only have attacking prowess aside from me. And regarding your lack of strength, you don't have to fear about that. I will make a tsunade out of you." Asia, who heard him, was wondering what tsunade is but didn't thought too much about it. She then asked, "And what about school?" Tatsuya looked at her and said, "Well, you can go to school, but like all of us, you will be directly joining high school, but don't worry, I will teach you all the basics before that." Asia smiled and said, "Thank you, and please take care of me from now on." Tatsuya smiled as well, and then both of them went back to the hotel in which Tatsuya was staying, packed their things up, and later that day, both of them went back to Japan.
Hello, everyone. As we wrap up this video, I want to share a quick note. I have a Patreon account. If you'd like to support me and enjoy on-demand audiobooks, you can become a Patreon member. Alternatively, you can check out my Google Drive link, which has 500+ novel audiobooks available through my Ko-fi or Patreon shop. I appreciate your support.